In the vast expanse of the Russian Empire during the late 19th century, the winds of change began to stir. It was a time of profound social, political, and cultural unrest. Amid the echoes of revolution and transformation, one figure would rise to reshape not only his homeland but the entire course of history. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Born in 1870, Lenin's journey was marked by a relentless commitment to ideas that would forever alter the world. He was a man of thought and action, navigating a tumultuous era of upheaval with a vision that challenged the foundations of the Tsarist regime. As the 20th century unfolded, Lenin would become a central figure in the Russian Revolution, setting the stage for the rise of the Soviet Union and the global spread of Marxist ideology. This documentary takes you through the entire life of Vladimir Lenin, from his early years in the quiet town of Simbirsk to the revolutionary halls of St. Petersburg, and through the turbulent days that followed his rise to power. It is a story of intellect, struggle, and a vision for a new world, one shaped by both ideals and harsh realities. As you listen to this story unfold, let the gentle pace of the narrative guide you through Lenin's life. May the details of his journey offer a moment of calm reflection, gently enveloping you in the history that shaped the world we know today. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you're listening from, but only when it feels right to do so. Let this story of Vladimir Lenin accompany you through the night, as we take you on a quiet, unhurried journey through his life. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born on April 22, 1870 in the town of Simbirsk, located along the Volga River in the heart of Russia. At the time of his birth, the Russian Empire was ruled by Tsar Alexander II, a monarch who had recently enacted significant reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. Despite these reforms, Russia remained an empire in which the majority of the population lived under strict autocratic rule, and the aristocracy held much of the power. It was a world far removed from the one that Lenin would help bring into being, one marked by social equality and the dismantling of old hierarchies. Lenin's family background was a source of considerable influence throughout his life. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, was a well-respected civil servant who held the position of a district inspector for schools. A man with a passion for education, Ilya instilled in his children the importance of learning and intellectual curiosity. Though a middle-class family by Russian standards, the Ulyanovs were not wealthy. They were part of a class that was caught between the nobility and the growing merchant class. Yet despite their modest means, they valued education highly, and this would come to play a crucial role in Vladimir's later development. Lenin's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was a woman of deep intellect, but she was also deeply affected by the tragedies that befell her family. Born into a noble family of German descent, Maria was well educated and had a strong interest in literature and the sciences. Though her family had faced a sharp decline in fortune due to the collapse of the serf system and other economic difficulties, she remained devoted to her children's education. Her influence was perhaps the most formative, as she was the one who encouraged Vladimir's independent thinking and intellectual pursuits. Vladimir was the second of 6 children, though only 3 of his siblings survived infancy. His older brother Alexander was especially influential in his early years. A brilliant student, Alexander was an early role model for Vladimir. However, it was Alexander's tragic death that would play a crucial role in shaping Lenin's political journey. In 1887, Alexander was arrested for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Tsar Alexander III. The authorities executed him, and this event left a profound mark on Vladimir. The loss of his brother led Lenin to question the nature of the Russian state and the system of government that allowed such an injustice to occur. The death of his brother was a defining moment for Lenin. It was not merely the death of a family member, but a catalyst for the transformation of Vladimir from a young intellectual into a revolutionary thinker. In his later writings, Lenin would often speak of the necessity of political action, and the personal loss of Alexander became an emotional touchstone in his ideological development. It was through this grief that Lenin's commitment to revolution began to take its most serious form, as he came to believe that the existing social order was one that only bred injustice and oppression. Lenin's early life in Simbirsk was marked by both privilege and tragedy. The family's home was modest but comfortable, located on the banks of the Volga River. Here, the young Vladimir would spend much of his time reading, an activity that would shape him for the rest of his life. Although his school days were largely uneventful, they provided him with a strong foundation in the classics and the sciences. He excelled in his studies, particularly in mathematics and history, subjects that would later influence his political thinking. The town of Simbirsk, though not large, was a place of contrasts. The slow-moving river contrasted with the rapid societal changes taking place within Russia. It was a period in which new ideas were beginning to emerge, despite the oppressive nature of Tsarist Russia. This intellectual ferment would eventually reach Lenin, whose inquisitive nature led him to seek out new ideas beyond the confines of his family's home. As Lenin grew older, his thoughts began to turn toward the political climate of his time. Russia in the late 19th century was a land of sharp divisions. The ruling Tsarist regime continued to impose strict controls on society, while the working classes and peasants languished in poverty. The gap between the rich and the poor was wide, and the system seemed to offer little hope for change. It was against this backdrop of social inequality that Lenin began to develop his revolutionary ideas, though at this point he was still a young man, learning the basic tenets of Marxism that would eventually shape his worldview. The influence of Marxist theory, however, did not come immediately. Lenin was first exposed to radical ideas through his brother's involvement with student groups and the intellectual circles that flourished in Russian universities at the time. These groups, many of them inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, advocated for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of a society based on equality and the common ownership of property. It was within this context that Lenin's intellectual development began to take a sharp turn. Though initially skeptical, Lenin eventually became deeply committed to the ideals of Marxism. By the time he was in his late teens, Lenin had developed a deep understanding of the inequities of the Russian system. He had also come to understand that intellectual inquiry alone would not bring about change. It was action, revolutionary action, that would be necessary to topple the existing order. These realizations laid the groundwork for the young man's political ambitions, which would soon take him far beyond the quiet confines of Simbirsk. The family's experience, marked by both privilege and tragedy, set the stage for Lenin's transformation from a curious intellectual into a committed revolutionary. His early years were marked by a combination of personal loss, intellectual exploration, and exposure to the social inequalities of his time. These formative experiences would shape the man he would become, a leader determined to change the world. His early days in Simbirsk were only the beginning of a journey that would take him from small-town Russia to the heart of a revolutionary movement that would change the course of history forever. Vladimir Lenin's early childhood, spent in the small town of Simbirsk, was a formative period that shaped much of his later political thinking and revolutionary fervour. As a young boy, he was surrounded by the influences of his family, particularly his mother Maria, whose intellectual curiosity and devotion to her children's education left a lasting impression. Though his family was by no means wealthy, the Ulyanovs valued education and culture, which provided young Vladimir with opportunities that many of his peers did not have. His early years were marked by a deep sense of loss. In 1886, when Lenin was just 16 years old, his father passed away unexpectedly. Ilya Ulyanov's death had a profound impact on the young Vladimir, who'd looked up to his father as a role model. The loss of his father meant that Lenin had to mature quickly and take on more responsibility within the family. It was during this period that Vladimir began to cultivate a sense of independence and a determination to succeed. This loss also shaped his understanding of authority and the state, feelings that would eventually develop into revolutionary zeal. The young Lenin's education was deeply influenced by his family's commitment to intellectual pursuits. He excelled in his studies, particularly in the subjects of history and literature. His teachers recognized his brilliance, and he was often praised for his intellectual curiosity. However, it was not just academic excellence that defined his early years. Lenin's childhood was also marked by the formation of his character. He was an independent thinker, often questioning authority and the social norms of the time. His exposure to radical ideas, particularly those of the growing socialist movement, began during these formative years. At the age of 16, Lenin enrolled at Kazan University, where he began to experience the political turbulence that would shape his life. The university was a hotbed of radical thought, and it was here that Lenin first came into contact with Marxist ideas. In 1887, while still a student, Lenin's older brother Alexander, who'd been involved in radical political activities, was arrested and executed for his role in a failed assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. This tragic event marked a turning point in Lenin's life and had a profound impact on his political development. The death of his brother Alexander left a void in Lenin's life, but it also propelled him into action. Alexander's execution served as a stark reminder to Vladimir of the brutal reality of the Tsarist regime, and it motivated him to dedicate himself to the cause of revolution. The personal loss was a catalyst for his intellectual awakening and his decision to pursue radical politics. Lenin's grief, however, was not merely personal. It became the foundation for his revolutionary ideals. He believed that the Tsarist regime, which had condemned his brother to death, was corrupt and oppressive, and that it must be overthrown. At Kazan University, Lenin quickly became involved in student activism. The university environment was ripe with political ferment, and the students were becoming increasingly disillusioned with the autocratic rule of Tsar Alexander III. Lenin, already influenced by his family's commitment to intellectualism and his personal loss, began to advocate for revolutionary change. It was during his time at Kazan that Lenin's political beliefs solidified, and he began to focus on the writings of Karl Marx. He was particularly drawn to Marx's critique of capitalism and his vision of a workers' revolution that would overthrow the capitalist system and replace it with the socialist order. However, Lenin's time at Kazan University was short-lived. In 1887, he was arrested for his involvement in a student protest. The authorities accused him of participating in a revolutionary conspiracy, and Lenin was expelled from the university. He was sent into exile in the remote province of Kostroma, a punishment that would have far-reaching consequences for his future. During his time in exile, Lenin continued to study Marxist theory, which deepened his commitment to the revolutionary cause. His time in exile also allowed him to reflect on the political climate of Russia and the need for change. Lenin believed that the working class needed to be organized and that the Tsarist regime could only be overthrown through revolution. His exposure to the writings of Marx and Engels, as well as his own experiences in exile, solidified his belief in the necessity of armed struggle to achieve social change. The experience of exile also gave Lenin the time and space to develop his own political ideas. He began to refine his understanding of Marxism and to develop his own theories on how to achieve a socialist revolution. Lenin became convinced that the working class or proletariat must lead the revolution. However, he also believed that a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries would be needed to guide the workers and provide leadership. This idea of a vanguard party would become a cornerstone of Lenin's political philosophy and would play a crucial role in his leadership of the Russian Revolution. Lenin's time in exile was a period of intellectual growth and political development. He immersed himself in Marxist literature and began to formulate his own ideas about the revolution. It was during this time that Lenin developed the determination to dedicate his life to the cause of revolution. He also began to develop a sense of urgency about the need for change. Lenin saw the Tsarist regime as a deeply oppressive and unjust system that needed to be overthrown, and he became increasingly convinced that the working class was the key to bringing about this change. The political climate in Russia was changing, and Lenin's early experiences, both personal and intellectual, had a profound influence on his revolutionary thinking. By the time he had completed his exile and returned to the political arena, Lenin had become a committed revolutionary. His childhood and formative years had shaped his character, his beliefs, and his vision for the future of Russia. They had also set him on the path to become one of the most influential figures in the history of the 20th century. After his time in exile, Vladimir Lenin returned to St. Petersburg in the early 1890s, where his education and political thinking began to take clearer form. By this time, he had already experienced the profound impact of losing his father and his brother Alexander. His exile had deepened his intellectual curiosity and strengthened his resolve to bring about revolutionary change. As he resumed his education, Lenin's academic and political journey became more focused, aligning his thoughts with the radical Marxist ideas that would ultimately shape his revolutionary path. Lenin's return to St. Petersburg marked the beginning of his serious commitment to political activity. The city, then the capital of the Russian Empire, was a hotbed of intellectual activity and political unrest. It was here that Lenin first became deeply involved in Marxism, a movement that was gaining momentum in Russia, particularly among the intellectuals and the working class. Lenin's exposure to Marxist theory came through the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose critiques of capitalism resonated strongly with his own sense of injustice. At this time, Lenin was studying law at the University of St. Petersburg. He had initially pursued law as a practical field that would allow him to have a steady career, but his academic interests increasingly gravitated toward the study of history, economics, and philosophy. It was through his studies of these subjects that Lenin began to develop a broader understanding of the social and economic systems that governed Russia and the world. His immersion in Marxism at this time was a pivotal moment in Lenin's development. Marx's theory of class struggle and the idea of a workers' revolution, in which the proletariat would overthrow the capitalist system, aligned with Lenin's own frustrations with the political and social system in Russia. The Marxist idea that history was shaped by the conflict between different social classes resonated deeply with Lenin's belief that the Russian autocracy was an inherently unjust system that needed to be dismantled. In St. Petersburg, Lenin was also introduced to other revolutionaries and activists who shared his ideals. The intellectual circles in the city were buzzing with revolutionary fervor, and Lenin became actively involved in these discussions. It was through these connections that Lenin first began to articulate his vision of a socialist future, one in which the working class would take control of the means of production and eliminate the exploitation inherent in capitalism. During this period, Lenin's life choices took a decisive turn. He began to see himself not merely as an academic or an intellectual, but as someone whose purpose was to organize the masses and lead them in a revolution. His education, which had initially been about securing a respectable career in law, became secondary to his political ambitions. Lenin now viewed his education as a tool to advance his revolutionary goals. He immersed himself in the works of Marx, Engels, and other socialist thinkers, refining his ideas and developing a clearer vision of how to achieve the revolution he believed in. In 1893, Lenin joined the Union for the Liberation of the Working Class, a Marxist organization that aimed to unite the workers and intellectuals in their struggle against the Tsarist government. This organization was one of the first steps in Lenin's transition from an academic theorist to an active political revolutionary. It was in this context that Lenin began to develop his revolutionary strategy, focusing on the need for a disciplined vanguard party to lead the working class to power. This idea would later become one of the cornerstones of Leninist thought. Lenin's decision to devote himself fully to the cause of revolution had profound consequences for his personal life. In 1895, he was arrested once again for his political activities. He had been involved in distributing revolutionary literature and organizing workers, and the authorities saw him as a threat to the status quo. Lenin was exiled to Siberia once more, but this time the period of exile would prove to be even more important for his ideological development. The time he spent in exile allowed him to read and reflect deeply on Marxist theory, and it was during this period that he began to write extensively. While in Siberia, Lenin worked on developing his theoretical ideas, particularly regarding the nature of the revolutionary movement. He wrote articles that explored the relationship between the proletariat and the peasantry, the role of intellectuals in revolutionary movements, and the structure of the party that would lead the revolution. These writings laid the intellectual groundwork for Lenin's later contributions to Marxist theory, and provided the foundation for his leadership of the Russian Revolution. Lenin's time in Siberia also allowed him to reflect on the challenges of organizing a revolution in Russia, where the working class was small and the peasantry was largely illiterate and politically disengaged. This was a crucial period in Lenin's life, as he began to develop the idea of a vanguard party, a disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries that would lead the workers and peasants to power. Lenin believed that only through such a party could the revolution succeed. This idea would later become central to his approach to revolution and governance. After his exile ended in 1900, Lenin moved to Europe, where he continued to build connections with other Marxist revolutionaries. In Switzerland, he became involved with the Iskra newspaper, a publication that aimed to unite Marxist groups across Russia and Europe. Lenin's involvement with Iskra marked a new phase in his political career, as he worked to unite the various factions of the Russian socialist movement and establish a more organized, centralized revolutionary movement. His writings during this period became more focused on the practical aspects of revolution, and he began to develop the strategies that would later guide the Bolshevik Party to victory. Lenin's early education and life choices were pivotal in shaping his revolutionary path. His time in St. Petersburg, his exposure to Marxism, and his involvement in revolutionary activities led him to make the decision to dedicate his life to the cause of revolution. His experiences in exile and his writings during this period helped to refine his ideas and solidify his commitment to the Marxist cause. Lenin's early years were marked by the formation of his revolutionary ideology, which would guide him throughout his life and shape the future of Russia and the world. As Lenin's understanding of Marxism deepened, his commitment to the revolution became unwavering. His life choices, both academic and political, had set him on a path from which there would be no turning back. Lenin was now a revolutionary, fully dedicated to the cause of overthrowing the Tsarist regime and building a new socialist society. His intellectual development and political decisions during these years were critical in shaping the leader he would become and the revolutionary movement he would lead. By the turn of the 20th century, Vladimir Lenin had firmly established himself within the revolutionary movement. But it was at this point in his life that a critical decision would shape the future of his career and the course of Russian history. Lenin's early years had been defined by intellectual development, political activism, and exile. Yet it was the culmination of these experiences that led to a decisive moment. The moment when Lenin fully embraced the need for organized revolution and the idea of a vanguard party to lead the working class. During the late 1890s and into the early 1900s, Lenin began to see more clearly the challenges that Russia faced and the form that revolutionary change would need to take. He had already been exposed to the ideas of Marxism, but as he grew more involved in the revolutionary movement, he began to develop his own theories and strategies for carrying out a successful revolution. One of the most pivotal decisions Lenin made during this period was to commit himself fully to the cause of a socialist revolution in Russia, one that would fundamentally alter the political structure of the empire. Lenin's commitment to revolutionary change was not an abstract intellectual exercise, but a deeply personal and urgent necessity. Russia, under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II, was an empire marked by deep inequalities. The autocracy was oppressive, the majority of the population lived in poverty, and the political elite maintained their power through repression and control. Lenin, with his exposure to Marxism and his growing understanding of the social injustices around him, concluded that the existing system could not be reformed. It had to be overthrown. The decision to become an active revolutionary came with significant personal sacrifice. Lenin's earlier involvement in political activities, including his participation in the Union for the Liberation of the Working Class, had already led to his exile in Siberia. While in exile, Lenin immersed himself in Marxist literature, and his ideas began to take a sharper, more practical focus. He came to believe that in order to overthrow the Tsarist regime, a highly organized, disciplined revolutionary party was necessary. This party, Lenin argued, would lead the working class and the peasantry in a revolution, providing the direction and the means to achieve political power. This idea of a vanguard party was a defining moment in Lenin's intellectual development. Marx had written about the need for the working class to overthrow the capitalist system, but Lenin saw the Russian Revolution as requiring a leadership element that Marx had not fully developed in his writings. Lenin's vanguard party would be a small, tightly knit group of professional revolutionaries, guided by a unified ideology and committed to a central strategic approach to overthrowing the ruling regime. Lenin's decision to embrace the idea of the vanguard party set him apart from many other Marxists of the time. While some believed that the revolution would be a spontaneous movement driven by the masses, Lenin's vision was more structured. He believed that the workers, though the most oppressed class, were not yet capable of leading a revolution on their own. They needed a political organization that could guide them, educate them, and provide the direction necessary to overthrow the state. The vanguard party, in Lenin's view, would be the spearhead of the revolution, leading the way and preparing the workers for their ultimate role in the overthrow of Tsarism. This decision, this embrace of a more centralized strategic approach to revolution, was not without its risks. Lenin understood that his ideas were controversial, even among other revolutionaries. Many within the socialist movement believed that the revolution would come naturally, driven by the will of the people. Lenin, however, saw the need for professional revolutionaries who could direct the masses and keep the movement on track. He was willing to take risks, make sacrifices, and dedicate his life to this cause, convinced that it was the only way to achieve the change that Russia so desperately needed. As Lenin's thinking solidified, so did his commitment to action. He began to advocate for the creation of a political party that would not only challenge the Tsarist regime, but eventually lead to the establishment of a socialist state. This was a major turning point in Lenin's life. While he had been involved in revolutionary activities before, this moment marked the point at which Lenin truly understood the depth of the commitment required for the kind of revolution he envisioned. It was no longer enough to be a theoretical Marxist or a passive participant in the revolutionary cause. Lenin now saw himself as a leader of the movement, a leader who would guide Russia through the turbulent years to come. This was also a time of increasing radicalization within Russia. The Tsarist regime, threatened by the growing revolutionary movements, had begun to crack down harder on dissidents. In response, Lenin's ideas became more radical, his commitment to revolution more unwavering. He called for a more forceful response to the Tsarist state, and emphasized the need for the working class to rise up and take power. This was a defining moment in his life, one that would set the course of the Russian Revolution and shape the future of the Soviet Union. As Lenin's leadership in the movement grew, so did his ideological influence. His writings during this period, particularly his work on the role of the Revolutionary Party, laid the foundation for what would later be known as Leninism. His belief in the need for a strong, disciplined party that could lead the revolution would become the central tenet of his political philosophy. This philosophy would guide Lenin throughout his life and influence the future course of history. Despite the risks and opposition to his ideas, Lenin remained steadfast in his belief that the time for revolution had come. His personal sacrifices were immense, and his life became one dedicated to the cause of overthrowing the Tsarist state and establishing a new, socialist society. The decision to create a vanguard party was a turning point in Lenin's life, a decision that would shape not only his destiny, but also the fate of Russia and the world. This moment of change marked the beginning of a journey that would culminate in the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the creation of the Soviet Union that followed. In the years to come, Lenin's vision of revolution would be tested, refined, and put into practice. His commitment to the cause, his ability to inspire others, and his unwavering belief in the necessity of change would make him one of the most significant and controversial figures of the 20th century. But it all began with that critical decision to commit fully to the cause of revolution, to embrace the idea of the vanguard party, and to take action in pursuit of a new socialist future. By the early 20th century, Vladimir Lenin had become an established figure in the Russian revolutionary movement, committed to the Marxist cause and determined to overthrow the Tsarist regime. However, as his influence grew, so did the challenges and conflicts that would test both his political ideology and his personal resolve. Lenin's life during this period was marked by ideological battles within the socialist movement, increasing repression from the Tsarist government, and the growing tension between different factions of the revolutionary cause. One of the earliest and most significant conflicts Lenin faced was internal division within the Russian socialist movement. Marxist thought in Russia had begun to splinter, with differing schools of thought emerging on how to best achieve the revolution. The primary division was between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, the latter led by Lenin himself. The Mensheviks were more moderate in their approach, advocating for a broad-based party that included workers, peasants, and intellectuals. They believed that the revolution would come in stages, and that the working class needed to ally with the bourgeoisie in a democratic revolution before socialism could be realized. In contrast, Lenin and the Bolsheviks held a more radical vision. Lenin argued that the bourgeoisie would never be a reliable ally in the revolution, and that the working class needed to seize power directly, without waiting for a gradual transformation. The Bolsheviks, in Lenin's view, should be a disciplined, centralized party, focused on the leadership of the proletariat in a direct and violent overthrow of the existing regime. This ideological conflict between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks would shape much of the revolutionary landscape in the years to come, with Lenin's faction eventually emerging as the dominant force in the Russian Revolution. The ideological disagreements within the Russian socialist movement were not the only source of conflict for Lenin. By 1905, the political situation in Russia was rapidly deteriorating. The country was facing growing unrest, with strikes and protests erupting across the empire. The Russian economy was in turmoil, and the working class was becoming increasingly disillusioned with the Tsarist regime. The failed war with Japan, 1904 to 1905, had humiliated the Tsar, and the people's frustration with the monarchy was reaching a breaking point. In response to the growing discontent, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to concede to some reforms, including the creation of the Duma, a legislative assembly, in an effort to placate the populace. However, the Duma was weak and largely ineffective, and the Tsar continued to resist meaningful political change. For Lenin and the Bolsheviks, this was a pivotal moment. While many socialists, including the Mensheviks, believed that the Duma could provide a peaceful avenue for reform, Lenin saw it as nothing more than a facade designed to maintain the Tsar's power. The Mensheviks' belief in gradual reform clashed sharply with Lenin's revolutionary urgency. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War and the Bloody Sunday Massacre, when peaceful protesters were gunned down by Tsarist forces, sparked a wave of strikes, protests, and uprisings. Lenin, despite his relatively modest status as a revolutionary leader at the time, saw these events as evidence of the broader potential for revolution. The 1905 revolution, though ultimately unsuccessful, would prove to be a formative moment for Lenin. It demonstrated the volatility of the political landscape and the possibility of mobilizing the masses in an uprising against the Tsar. Though the 1905 revolution ended in defeat, it solidified Lenin's conviction that Russia was ripe for revolution. However, Lenin also recognized the importance of discipline within the revolutionary movement. His commitment to the idea of the Vanguard Party, a tightly controlled, ideologically unified organization of professional revolutionaries, became all the more important in the wake of the 1905 events. He believed that the revolution would only succeed if it was led by a small group of determined, committed individuals who could maintain control and guide the workers and peasants toward their ultimate goal of overthrowing the monarchy. The failure of the 1905 revolution did not deter Lenin. Instead, it reinforced his belief that the revolution would be a long and difficult struggle, one that would require perseverance, strategic thinking, and a willingness to make difficult decisions. Lenin's ideological battles with other socialists, particularly the Mensheviks, were a reflection of his broader understanding that the path to revolution would be fraught with conflict, both external and internal. Lenin's ability to navigate these conflicts, his determination to push forward with his vision, and his willingness to challenge other factions in the socialist movement would set the stage for his future leadership in the Russian Revolution of 1917. In addition to the ideological struggles, Lenin was constantly under threat from the Tsarist police. His writings were banned, and his movements were closely monitored by the secret police, known as the Okhrana. Lenin spent much of this period in exile, moving from country to country in Europe to avoid arrest. Despite the constant surveillance, Lenin remained a tireless advocate for revolution, writing prolifically and building a network of supporters across Europe. His time in exile allowed him to build alliances with other revolutionary groups, including the Social Democratic Labour Party, which was divided into its own factions. Though Lenin's political career was marked by adversity, his ability to adapt to difficult situations was one of his greatest strengths. The obstacles he faced, both from within the revolutionary movement and from the Tsarist government, only served to strengthen his resolve. Lenin's unflinching commitment to the cause of revolution, his willingness to engage in ideological battles, and his focus on the long-term goal of overthrowing the Tsarist regime would ultimately lead him to triumph in the Russian Revolution of 1917. The conflict that Lenin faced during these years was not only about ideological purity, but also about practical strategy. Lenin's understanding of how to move the revolutionary movement forward was shaped by the events of 1905 and the internal conflicts within the socialist movement. His ability to steer the Bolshevik Party through these turbulent times and maintain a unified vision would become essential in the lead-up to the 1917 revolution. Lenin's focus on building a strong, disciplined organization, his commitment to armed struggle, and his unwavering belief in the necessity of revolution would ultimately define his leadership. By the time of the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Vladimir Lenin had firmly established himself as one of the most prominent figures in the Russian revolutionary movement. Though he'd spent much of his life in exile, Lenin had remained a tireless advocate for the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of a socialist government in Russia. His writings had shaped the direction of the revolutionary movement, and his commitment to the cause had never wavered, even in the face of constant repression from the Tsarist government. Now, with the war raging across Europe, Lenin's vision for revolution would be tested like never before. The war, which had initially caused Lenin to worry about the possibility of a socialist revolution being delayed, ultimately created an opportunity for his ideas to gain traction. As the war dragged on, disillusionment with the Tsarist regime grew, both among the general population and within the military. The war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian Empire, and the costs of the conflict became unbearable for the working class and the peasants, who were forced to bear the brunt of the suffering. The Russian army was faltering, the economy was in disarray, and public morale had collapsed. Lenin, in exile in Switzerland, saw the war as a moment of crisis for the Russian state and a potential opportunity for revolution. In 1915, he wrote his famous work, Imperialism, the higher stage of capitalism, in which he argued that the war was a manifestation of the capitalist system's contradictions. According to Lenin, imperialism, the domination of weaker nations by stronger capitalist powers, was a natural outcome of the capitalist system, and the war was simply an extension of these imperialist ambitions. Lenin believed that the war provided a unique opportunity for revolution, as the working class, exhausted by the war and the hardships it imposed, would be ripe for a socialist uprising. In 1917, with the war still raging, events in Russia began to take a dramatic turn. The Tsarist government, already weakened by years of mismanagement and repression, collapsed in the February Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and the Russian monarchy was replaced by a provisional government. However, the provisional government was weak, divided, and unable to meet the demands of the people. It promised reform but failed to end the war or address the deep economic problems facing the country. The workers, soldiers, and peasants, frustrated by the continuing war and worsening conditions, began to demand more radical change. For Lenin, the February Revolution was a pivotal moment. It confirmed what he had believed for years. The Tsarist regime could not be reformed, and only a revolutionary overthrow of the existing system could bring about true change. But Lenin was also acutely aware that the revolution was still unfinished. The provisional government, though it had overthrown the monarchy, was still made up of the same political elites, and was not committed to the full socialist transformation that Lenin envisioned. Lenin understood that the revolution had to be pushed further, and this required the Bolsheviks to seize power. Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, after years of exile. His arrival was both a moment of celebration and a signal of the decisive steps that needed to be taken. At this point, the Bolshevik Party, though still a minority in the revolutionary movement, had grown in strength. Lenin's leadership and ideas had shaped the party's platform, and the Bolsheviks were becoming the leading force in the struggle for power. Lenin's return was greeted with enthusiasm by the workers and soldiers, who saw in him the leadership they had been waiting for. Upon his return, Lenin wasted no time in outlining his vision for the future. In his April theses, Lenin called for the complete overthrow of the provisional government, the transfer of power to the Soviets, workers' councils, and the establishment of a socialist government. He rejected the idea of a bourgeois revolution and instead called for a second stage of revolution, one that would eliminate the remnants of the old system and create a new government based on the interests of the working class and the peasantry. Lenin's call for radical change was not universally accepted, even within the socialist movement. The Mensheviks, the moderate wing of the Russian socialist movement, argued that the provisional government should be allowed to continue its work, and that the revolution should proceed in stages. Lenin, however, was convinced that only a complete break with the old order would lead to true liberation for the people of Russia. He argued that the time had come for the Bolsheviks to lead the revolution to its final stage, and that the power of the state had to be transferred to the workers and peasants immediately. Lenin's message resonated with the masses, and the Bolshevik Party began to gain increasing support. The provisional government, meanwhile, continued to struggle with its inability to address the demands of the people, particularly its continued involvement in World War I. As the situation in Russia became more chaotic, Lenin's call for an immediate, complete revolution gained traction. In October 1917, the Bolshevik Party seized power in the October Revolution, a dramatic moment that would mark the beginning of a new era for Russia and the world. The success of the October Revolution was a culmination of Lenin's efforts to build a revolutionary movement that could mobilize the masses and seize power. But it was also the beginning of an incredibly difficult and turbulent period. After taking power, Lenin and the Bolsheviks faced fierce opposition from the old ruling classes, including the military, the aristocracy, and other factions within the socialist movement. The Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1923, ensued, with the Bolsheviks fighting against the White Army, a loose coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. The war was brutal, and millions of Russians died from combat, starvation, and disease. Despite these immense challenges, Lenin's leadership was crucial in ensuring the survival of the Bolshevik regime. Under his guidance, the Bolsheviks were able to win the Civil War, consolidate power, and lay the foundations for the Soviet Union. Lenin's policies during this period, including the nationalization of industry, land redistribution, and the establishment of a one-party state, were designed to secure the revolution and ensure that the working class would remain in power. By the time of his death in 1924, Lenin had successfully transformed Russia from an autocratic empire into the world's first socialist state. His legacy was one of profound change, from the overthrow of the Tsarist regime to the creation of a new political and economic order. However, Lenin's vision of socialism was still in its infancy, and his death left a power vacuum within the Bolshevik Party. The struggle for leadership would soon give rise to the figure of Joseph Stalin, whose policies would diverge significantly from Lenin's own, but that would be a story for a later time. Lenin's achievements during his lifetime, however, were monumental. He had led the Bolshevik Party through one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history, helped to bring about the end of Tsarist rule, and laid the foundation for the establishment of the Soviet Union. His legacy, while controversial, was undeniable. Lenin had changed the course of history, and the world would never be the same. By 1920, Lenin had led the Bolshevik Party through the chaos of the October Revolution and the tumult of the Russian Civil War. Under his leadership, the party had consolidated power, and the Soviet state had begun to take shape. However, despite the victory of the Bolsheviks, Lenin's journey was far from over. As the leader of the new Soviet government, Lenin faced numerous challenges, many of which tested not only his revolutionary ideals, but also his physical and mental endurance. Lenin's rise to power had been rapid, but maintaining control of the revolution was a more complicated task. The Civil War had left Russia in ruins, with the economy in shambles and millions of people displaced. The Bolsheviks had to rebuild the country from the ground up, while at the same time fighting off internal and external enemies. The economic situation was dire, and the people were growing increasingly disillusioned with the promises of the revolution. Lenin's government had to find ways to stabilize the country, restore order, and provide for the basic needs of the population. One of the most significant challenges Lenin faced was the deepening economic crisis. The war had devastated Russia's infrastructure, and the economy was heavily dependent on a wartime economy. The Bolsheviks had nationalized industries and redistributed land, but the country was still struggling with famine, shortages, and inflation. Lenin had hoped that the revolution would bring about a new, more equitable economic order, But the reality of governing a country in the midst of a civil war made this ideal difficult to achieve. To address the crisis, Lenin introduced a series of economic policies aimed at stabilizing the country. In 1921, after the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, Lenin implemented the new economic policy, NEP. The NEP marked a significant shift in policy, as it allowed some degree of private enterprise and market activity. Under the NEP, small businesses were allowed to operate, and peasants were allowed to sell surplus grain on the open market. This policy was a practical response to the economic hardships that the Soviet Union was facing, and it helped to restore some level of economic stability. However, the NEP was also a compromise. It represented a departure from the more radical policies that Lenin had initially espoused. Some members of the Bolshevik Party, particularly those on the left, viewed the NEP as a betrayal of the revolution's original goals. They argued that allowing private enterprise and market activity would undermine the socialist nature of the state and give rise to capitalist tendencies. Lenin, however, believed that the NEP was a necessary step to ensure the survival of the Soviet state. He argued that the revolution had to be preserved first, and that the NEP was a temporary measure to help rebuild the economy before a full transition to socialism could take place. The introduction of the NEP was a turning point for Lenin. It marked a moment of pragmatism and political realism, where Lenin had to confront the realities of governance. The NEP was not a perfect solution, but it allowed the Soviet Union to recover from the devastating effects of war and to begin the long process of rebuilding. However, this policy also exposed some of the contradictions within Lenin's vision for the revolution. The need to balance the ideals of socialism with the practical realities of governing a war-torn country highlighted the limits of Lenin's revolutionary project. In addition to the economic challenges, Lenin was also faced with political and ideological opposition within the Bolshevik Party itself. The most significant of these challenges came from the growing influence of Joseph Stalin, a member of the Bolshevik leadership who had gained prominence during the Revolution and the Civil War. While Stalin was a loyal supporter of Lenin, their relationship would soon become strained. Lenin began to criticize Stalin for his harsh methods and his concentration of power within the party. In 1922, Lenin wrote a letter to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, known as the Testament, in which he expressed his concerns about Stalin's leadership style and his growing influence. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were rooted in his belief that the Soviet Union needed a collective leadership, one that was based on democratic centralism and the free exchange of ideas. Lenin feared that Stalin's authoritarian tendencies and his lack of respect for party democracy could undermine the principles of the revolution. In his testament, Lenin called for Stalin's removal from the position of General Secretary of the Communist Party. However, Lenin's health was failing, and his political influence was diminishing. His testament was never fully implemented, and Stalin's power continued to grow. Lenin's declining health was another major challenge during this period. In 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to carry out his duties as leader of the Soviet Union. Over the next few years, Lenin's health continued to deteriorate, and he was forced to withdraw from active political life. This marked the beginning of a new phase in Lenin's life, as he struggled with both his physical decline and the growing political challenges within the Bolshevik Party. Lenin's personal struggle with illness was mirrored by the larger struggle within the Soviet state, as the revolutionary ideals he had fought for were increasingly challenged by the demands of governance and the realities of political power. During this time, Lenin turned his attention to the future of the revolution and the direction of the Soviet Union. He recognized that the revolution could not be sustained without strong, competent leadership. However, Lenin also feared that the party was becoming increasingly centralized and that the revolutionary ideals of the early days of the Bolshevik movement were being compromised. His criticisms of Stalin were a reflection of his larger concerns about the direction of the revolution and the concentration of power in the hands of a single leader. As Lenin's health continued to decline, the question of succession became more pressing. The political dynamics within the Bolshevik Party were shifting, and Lenin's death, which seemed increasingly inevitable, would leave a power vacuum that could lead to further internal strife. Lenin's inability to address these issues personally highlighted the fragility of the revolution he had worked so hard to build. His later years were marked by a growing sense of uncertainty about the future of the Soviet state and the direction of the communist movement. As the leader of the Bolshevik Party and the first head of the Soviet Union, Lenin had achieved many of his revolutionary aims. The overthrow of the Tsarist regime, the establishment of a socialist state, and the end of centuries of autocracy marked monumental achievements. Yet, as the revolution unfolded and the Soviet state began to take shape, Lenin found himself reflecting on the deep changes sweeping across Russia, changes that not only affected the political structure, but also the social fabric of the country. When Lenin came to power in 1917, Russia was a society deeply rooted in its history of feudalism, serfdom, and autocracy. The majority of the population was illiterate, poverty-stricken, and burdened by centuries of inequality. The challenge of building a new socialist society out of this deeply entrenched system was daunting. Yet Lenin's vision was one of profound transformation. To create a society where the working class, peasants, and all marginalized groups could achieve their rightful place in the political, economic, and social order. One of Lenin's key ideas was to redistribute land to the peasants. In the early days of Bolshevik rule, the government issued decrees that redistributed land to the people, breaking up the vast estates of the aristocracy and turning them over to the peasants. The goal was to dismantle the old feudal structure and give the peasantry a stake in the new society. For many peasants, this was a momentous change, and they eagerly embraced the opportunity to own the land they worked on for the first time. However, the implementation of land redistribution did not come without complications. The Soviet state, still in its infancy and grappling with the aftermath of civil war, struggled to provide support for the millions of peasants who now controlled the land. Many peasants lacked the knowledge, tools, and resources to farm the land efficiently. The collective farms that Lenin and his supporters envisioned as part of the socialist project were slow to materialize. This mismatch between the ideals of socialist collectivism and the realities of the agrarian economy led to difficulties in managing the land redistribution effectively. Another significant area of change was the transformation of labor relations. Lenin's government sought to create a state-controlled economy that would ensure the fair treatment of workers. This was done through the nationalization of major industries, including banking, transportation, and manufacturing. The Bolshevik government sought to replace capitalist exploitation with a system in which workers would collectively own and manage the means of production. Yet, as the revolution progressed, Lenin realized that this process of economic transformation was more complicated than he had initially envisioned. Industrial workers, while benefiting from the new government's focus on labor rights, were often still faced with difficult conditions. The Soviet government struggled to balance the need for central planning with the demands for workers' control. Lenin believed that the state had to guide the economy, but this often led to tensions between the state's authority and workers' self-management. The urban working class, though initially supportive of the Bolshevik government, began to face hardships as the revolution entered its later phases. The economy was still in ruins, and workers found themselves dealing with shortages of goods, inflation, and difficult working conditions. The government struggled to meet the demands of workers while also facing the pressures of the civil war, foreign intervention, and the need to consolidate power within the Soviet state. For Lenin, the revolution was not just about the redistribution of land or the nationalization of industry. It was about the creation of a new society in which all individuals could realize their full potential. However, the realities of governance often collided with the lofty ideals of the revolution. Lenin's vision was clear, but the path to realizing that vision was fraught with obstacles. The transition from a feudal, autocratic society to a modern socialist state was not a simple or smooth process. One of the most profound changes Lenin sought to bring about was in the cultural and intellectual spheres. Under Tsarist rule, Russian society was stifled by censorship, repression, and the suppression of new ideas. Lenin believed that the revolution should not only transform the political and economic structures of society, but also its cultural life. He sought to promote the arts, education, and intellectual freedom, all in service of the new socialist ideals. However, the implementation of this vision was far from easy. Lenin's government faced challenges in reforming education and culture, while also dealing with the ongoing demands of the Civil War. The Soviet state began to implement programs to promote literacy and education, particularly in rural areas, but these efforts were slow to take root. The Bolshevik government also encouraged the development of new forms of art and literature that would reflect the ideals of the revolution. Artists, writers, and intellectuals were encouraged to create works that celebrated the working class and the struggles of the revolution. However, these efforts were often hampered by the difficult conditions of the time and the ongoing political and economic instability. Lenin's vision of a new, open society clashed with the realities of state control. The more the Soviet government sought to control the economy, the more it found itself regulating the cultural life of the country. Lenin believed that art should serve the people, but as the years passed, the question of what constituted revolutionary art became a point of contention. Despite his early support for artistic freedom, the Soviet state began to impose stricter guidelines on artistic expression, and artists and intellectuals found themselves increasingly subject to state censorship. The rapid pace of change that Lenin had initiated in Russia created an atmosphere of uncertainty. The old world was collapsing, and the new world had yet to fully emerge. Lenin, for all his achievements, was aware of the profound challenges that lay ahead for the Soviet state. As he struggled with health issues in the final years of his life, he reflected on the difficulties of creating a truly socialist society. He understood that the revolution was not a one-time event, but a long, ongoing process that would require continuous struggle. Yet, despite the many challenges, Lenin remained committed to the revolutionary project. He saw the changes in Russia as only the beginning, a foundation upon which the future of the Soviet Union would be built. While his vision for a classless society was still far from complete, Lenin's leadership had irrevocably changed the course of Russian and world history. By 1922, Lenin's health had begun to significantly deteriorate, marking a shift in both his personal life and the course of the revolution he had fought so hard to create. Although the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union were remarkable achievements, Lenin now found himself grappling with the consequences of those victories. The pressure of leadership, the weight of the revolution, and the toll of ill health all began to change Lenin's role within the party, and his vision for the future of the Soviet state. After years of leading the revolution and consolidating Bolshevik power, Lenin's life took on a more reflective tone. The idealism that had fueled his early revolutionary fervour was now tempered by the immense challenges of governing. Lenin had become deeply aware of the growing tensions within the Bolshevik party and the increasing concentration of power. While he had always believed in a centralized disciplined party, he now found himself questioning whether the internal dynamics of the party were truly aligned with the values of the revolution. One of the most significant changes in Lenin's later years was his growing concern about the direction of the Soviet government. Lenin had always been a strong believer in collective leadership, but as the political landscape evolved, he began to see signs of centralization and authoritarianism within the party. Lenin's own health problems, including a stroke in 1922 that left him partially paralyzed, forced him to withdraw from active political life. While still able to write and communicate, he was no longer able to exert the same influence over day-to-day decisions in the government. During this time, Lenin became increasingly concerned about the rise of Joseph Stalin, who had become an influential figure within the Bolshevik Party. Stalin's consolidation of power, particularly his role as General Secretary of the Communist Party, was a source of growing unease for Lenin. Stalin had gained influence through his administrative abilities, his loyalty to Lenin, and his ruthless political maneuvering. However, Lenin, despite his health decline, recognized that Stalin's methods, his harsh treatment of party members and his growing power base, could threaten the future of the revolution. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were articulated in his testament, a document written in 1922 in which he criticized Stalin's leadership style. He accused Stalin of being too forceful and unaccountable, with a tendency to act in an authoritarian manner. Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. He believed that Stalin's concentration of power could undermine the collective leadership principle and jeopardize the future of the Soviet Union. Lenin's fears were not just about Stalin's character, they were about the broader implications for the Soviet state and the revolution's long-term success. However, Lenin's political influence had waned by the time his testament was written. Due to his declining health and the political complexities within the party, the document was not widely circulated. Lenin's criticism of Stalin was not immediately acted upon, and Stalin remained in power, gradually positioning himself as the leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. While Lenin's testament was not fully implemented, it nonetheless foreshadowed the intense power struggle that would follow his death in 1924. Beyond his concerns about Stalin, Lenin's later years were also marked by a sense of frustration with the pace and direction of the revolution. The immediate aftermath of the Civil War had brought relative stability, but the country remained deeply divided. The economic challenges were not easily overcome, and many of the revolutionary ideals Lenin had championed seemed at odds with the realities of governance. Lenin had always believed that the revolution would lead to the creation of a more just society. But as time passed, he grew increasingly skeptical about the ability of the Soviet government to fulfill that promise. Lenin's relationships within the party were also undergoing significant shifts. While he'd always been surrounded by close allies, the pressures of leadership and the growing internal divisions began to strain those relationships. Lenin's concerns about Stalin were compounded by his frustrations with the lack of ideological unity within the party. The Bolshevik leadership was not a monolith. It was divided between those who favoured a more pragmatic, less ideologically rigid approach to governance, and those who remained committed to the original ideals of the revolution. Lenin's own ideas were evolving, and he began to worry that the party's direction might veer away from his vision. As Lenin struggled with his health, his relationship with his comrades, including Leon Trotsky, became more strained. Trotsky had been one of Lenin's closest allies during the Revolution and the Civil War, and he had played a crucial role in organizing the Red Army. However, Trotsky's more radical approach to revolution and his growing influence within the party created tensions with Lenin, who had always valued party unity. Despite these tensions, Lenin and Trotsky remained aligned in many of their goals, and Lenin continued to see Trotsky as an essential part of the Bolshevik leadership. Nonetheless, the internal struggles within the party were becoming more pronounced, and Lenin's health made it increasingly difficult for him to mediate those conflicts. Throughout his later years, Lenin remained deeply committed to the revolutionary cause, but he was also keenly aware of the complexities of leadership and the difficulties of creating a new society out of the ruins of the old. His health issues forced him to slow down, but they also gave him time to reflect on the nature of power, governance, and the future of the Soviet Union. As Lenin's influence within the party began to wane, the question of succession became increasingly important, and the rivalries and ideological divisions within the Bolshevik leadership grew more pronounced. In the years following his stroke, Lenin continued to write, though his health made it difficult to do so with the same vigour as before. His final works, including critiques of the party and reflections on the future of the revolution, reveal a leader who was deeply concerned about the survival of the revolution he had helped create. He recognized that the revolution was still fragile and that its future would depend on the ability of the Soviet government to navigate the complex political, economic and social challenges that lay ahead. As Lenin's life drew to a close, his legacy was already beginning to take shape. The Soviet Union, though still in its infancy, had been transformed by the revolution. Lenin's leadership had shaped the trajectory of Russian history, and his ideas had become the foundation for the Soviet system. Yet, in his final years, Lenin was deeply ambivalent about the future. He had achieved much, but he was also increasingly aware of the challenges that the revolution still faced, challenges that would outlast his lifetime. By the early 1920s, Vladimir Lenin's health had sharply declined, marking a stark contrast to the vigorous revolutionary leader who had once led the Bolshevik Party through the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. His physical frailty, brought on by the multiple strokes he suffered beginning in 1922, began to diminish his ability to actively govern and direct the Soviet state. His mind remained sharp, but his body could no longer bear the weight of his immense responsibilities. Lenin's first stroke in May 1922 left him partially paralyzed, with the right side of his body affected. Though he retained the use of his intellect and was able to write, his ability to lead the revolution and manage day-to-day affairs was severely compromised. Lenin's health rapidly deteriorated after this first stroke. By December of that same year, he suffered another stroke, which further debilitated him, and he was unable to speak or write in a coherent manner. His once active role in the Bolshevik government was reduced to a passive observer, and his capacity to engage with the inner workings of the party was greatly diminished. With Lenin's physical decline, the power dynamics within the Bolshevik party began to shift. Lenin, who had once been at the forefront of all political decisions, was now largely sidelined, though his ideas and influence continued to play a significant role in the party's direction. His decline marked the beginning of a dangerous political vacuum, one that would soon be filled by the rising figure of Joseph Stalin. Though Lenin had become increasingly concerned about Stalin's growing power and his authoritarian methods, Lenin's declining health prevented him from effectively intervening in the party's internal struggles. Lenin's personal struggle with illness was mirrored by the struggles of the Soviet government itself. While the Bolsheviks had succeeded in establishing the Soviet Union and consolidating power, the new government still faced enormous challenges. The country remained deeply impoverished, the economy was still in ruins from the Civil War, and the revolution's ideals were increasingly tested by the harsh realities of governing. Lenin's declining health made it more difficult for him to address these pressing issues, and further complicated his ability to navigate the ideological and political divisions within the Bolshevik party. As Lenin's condition worsened, the question of succession became more pressing. His closest allies, including Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev, were all vying for influence within the party, while Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, was quietly consolidating his power. Lenin had been concerned about Stalin's methods and leadership style for some time, and as his health deteriorated, he made his concerns known in private. In his famous Testament, written in late 1922 and early 1923, Lenin outlined his growing unease with Stalin's role in the party. He described Stalin as being excessively harsh and ruthless, and he suggested that Stalin should be removed from his position as General Secretary. Lenin also criticized Stalin's treatment of fellow party members and his lack of respect for party democracy. Despite this, Lenin was unable to take any concrete action against Stalin due to his declining health. The testament was never fully acted upon. Lenin's colleagues, particularly Stalin's rivals, were unable to push through Lenin's recommendations due to their own political struggles, and Stalin himself worked to ensure that Lenin's criticisms were kept out of the public eye. This left Stalin in a relatively strong position to rise to power once Lenin passed away, despite Lenin's explicit warnings. Lenin's thoughts on the future of the revolution were clouded by his health struggles. He recognized that the revolution had succeeded in establishing a new political order, but he also saw that the Soviet system was still deeply flawed. The ideal of a stateless, classless society that Marx had envisioned was still a distant dream. Lenin had always believed that the revolution was only the beginning, that the real work would come in building socialism. However, as his physical condition deteriorated, Lenin began to realize the scale of the challenge that lay ahead. The new Soviet government was still fragile, and its internal contradictions were becoming more apparent by the day. Despite his health problems, Lenin remained intellectually engaged in the political affairs of the day. He continued to write, albeit with difficulty, and he maintained contact with party members. He was particularly concerned with the rise of bureaucratism within the Soviet government. Lenin had always been wary of the concentration of power in the hands of a few individuals, and as Stalin's influence grew, Lenin became increasingly concerned about the potential for the party to abandon its revolutionary ideals in favor of authoritarianism and centralization. Lenin's personal relationships also underwent a shift during this period. Once deeply involved in the day-to-day politics of the Bolshevik Party, he now relied heavily on his wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, and his close allies to communicate his ideas and concerns. Krupskaya, a key figure in the Bolshevik movement and a trusted companion to Lenin, remained loyal to her husband and helped him navigate the political complexities of the Soviet government during his illness. Lenin's bond with Krupskaya and his other close comrades remained strong, even as his ability to lead diminished. Lenin's final years were marked by a growing sense of urgency, as he recognized that the revolution he had fought for could not survive without the right leadership. As his death approached, Lenin began to consider the future of the party and the Soviet Union. His concern about Stalin's rising power and his authoritarian methods was a reflection of Lenin's desire to preserve the original ideals of the revolution. Lenin knew that the future of the Soviet state would depend on how the party dealt with these internal divisions and power struggles. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at the age of 53. His death marked the end of an era in Soviet Russia and the beginning of a new political phase. Although Lenin's health had deteriorated in his final years, his influence on the Soviet Union remained profound. Lenin had been the architect of the revolution, and his ideas formed the foundation of the Soviet system. However, his death also left a power vacuum, one that would soon be filled by the ambitious Stalin, whose vision for the future of the Soviet Union would differ significantly from Lenin's. As the Soviet Union prepared for the loss of its most influential leader, Vladimir Lenin's final days were marked by a mixture of reflection, mourning, and the quiet realization that his long struggle was over. After a life filled with immense sacrifice, ideological fervor, and political upheaval, Lenin's death on January 21, 1924, was the end of an era for both him personally and the revolution he had led. However, his death also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Soviet Union, one that would unfold in ways that Lenin himself could not have anticipated. By the time Lenin passed away, the Soviet Union had begun to solidify its revolutionary gains. The Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, the establishment of the Soviet government, and the political consolidation of power were all significant milestones. Yet Lenin's death left the Bolshevik Party with unresolved challenges, many of which would shape the country's future for years to come. Lenin had built the foundations of the Soviet state, but the future direction of the revolution was now uncertain. Lenin's final years had been dominated by health problems, as repeated strokes left him physically debilitated and unable to fully engage in political matters. His concerns about the future of the revolution, particularly his criticisms of Joseph Stalin and the growing bureaucratization of the Communist Party, were well known. Lenin's last major political work, his Testament, written in late 1922 and early 1923, had explicitly warned against Stalin's rising power. Lenin had feared that Stalin's authoritarian style could undermine the collective leadership he had long championed. In the Testament, he suggested that Stalin should be removed from his position as General Secretary and expressed concerns about Stalin's brutal handling of fellow party members. However, Lenin's decline prevented him from taking any decisive action against Stalin during his lifetime. Stalin's rivals within the Bolshevik Party, including Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, lacked the political unity or the strength to challenge Stalin effectively. When Lenin died, Stalin had already positioned himself as a key player within the party leadership, and his influence would only grow in the years to come. Lenin's death, therefore, marked the beginning of a power struggle within the Bolshevik Party, with Stalin emerging as the dominant figure after the initial period of mourning. In the immediate aftermath of Lenin's death, his funeral became a moment of public mourning and reverence. The Soviet state sought to honor Lenin's memory by presenting him as the father of the revolution and the architect of the new socialist state. Lenin's body was embalmed and placed on public display in Moscow's Red Square, where it became a symbol of the revolution and the enduring legacy of his leadership. The spectacle of Lenin's funeral and the preservation of his body marked the beginning of what would become the cult of personality that would surround him in the years to come. Lenin's legacy, however, was not solely defined by the way he was remembered by the Soviet government. His influence on the course of history was profound, and the ideology he espoused, Marxism-Leninism, became the foundation of Soviet policy for decades. Lenin's ideas about the role of the vanguard party, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the need for a centralized revolutionary state continued to shape Soviet politics long after his death. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, would go on to become one of the world's most powerful and authoritarian states, and Lenin's revolutionary ideals would be interpreted and applied in ways that Lenin himself might not have foreseen. In the years following his death, Lenin's image became an integral part of Soviet propaganda. His writings and speeches were enshrined as sacred texts, and his name became synonymous with the ideals of the revolution. The state would go on to present Lenin as a visionary, a tireless revolutionary who had sacrificed everything for the cause of the working class. While Lenin's political vision had been shaped by his experiences and his understanding of the Marxist tradition, the Soviet state sought to turn him into a symbol of purity and unwavering commitment to the socialist cause. Lenin's death also had a profound impact on the communist movement beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. As the leader of the first socialist state, Lenin's revolutionary ideas had inspired workers and intellectuals around the world. Lenin's influence was felt in revolutionary movements across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, where his writings and the example of the Soviet Revolution served as a beacon for those seeking to overthrow capitalist systems. Even after his death, Lenin continued to be a source of inspiration for revolutionary movements, and his ideas shaped the trajectory of global socialism. However, Lenin's legacy is not without its complexities. While he is revered as the father of the Soviet state and the architect of the revolution, his methods, including the use of violence and repression to secure power, have been the subject of ongoing debate. Lenin's commitment to a single-party state, his suppression of political opposition, and his tolerance of authoritarian measures in the name of the revolution were later adopted and expanded upon by Stalin. This has led to a nuanced legacy for Lenin, a leader whose revolutionary ideals were in many ways realized, but whose methods and the consequences of those methods have been questioned by historians and political analysts. Lenin's vision of a stateless, classless society was ultimately not achieved in his lifetime. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, became a highly centralized and authoritarian state. Stalin's purges, the establishment of a totalitarian regime, and the oppression of political dissent were all developments that Lenin would likely have opposed had he lived to see them. Yet despite these contradictions, Lenin's leadership left an indelible mark on the course of world history. His ideas about the nature of revolution, the role of the working class, and the need for a socialist state continue to influence political thought and revolutionary movements to this day. Lenin's legacy, then, is both celebrated and contested. He remains a towering figure in the history of the 20th century, and his impact on the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union is undeniable. Yet, as time has passed, the complexities of his vision and the consequences of his policies have led to ongoing reflection and re-evaluation. Lenin's memory continues to be both a source of inspiration and a subject of critical analysis as the world continues to grapple with the legacies of revolution and the pursuit of social justice. Lenin's revolutionary ideals didn't just reshape the political and economic structures of Russia, they had a profound impact on the country's entire social fabric. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 sought to abolish the centuries-old structures of Imperial Russia, replacing them with the socialist vision that Lenin had fought for, a society based on equality, justice, and workers' power. But the reality of transforming such a vast and deeply divided society proved far more complex than Lenin had imagined. One of the most immediate and visible changes brought about by the revolution was the redistribution of land to the peasants. Under Tsarist rule, the vast majority of Russians were peasants, working the land of wealthy landowners or the state, with little to no hope of improving their conditions. Lenin's government, in the early stages of Bolshevik rule, sought to eliminate the old aristocracy and redistribute land among the peasants, effectively dismantling the old feudal system that had persisted for centuries. The Bolsheviks, however, faced immense challenges in implementing this vision. The vast rural population, which had long been marginalized, did not have the necessary skills, resources, or infrastructure to manage the newly redistributed land. Moreover, the collectivization efforts that Lenin and other Bolsheviks had initially supported were slow to take shape, and many peasants resisted the idea of collectivizing their farms. The experience of the early Soviet state showed the difficulty in reconciling the promise of social justice with the practical realities of agrarian life in a war-torn country. Urban society was also transformed in profound ways. The Bolsheviks, aiming to dismantle the old capitalist structures, nationalized major industries, bringing them under state control. Lenin envisioned a system where the working class would control production, but this proved to be another difficult task. With industrialization still in its infancy and the economy suffering from the ravages of war, the new Soviet state struggled to provide the necessary conditions for workers to take control of factories. While the Bolsheviks did institute some worker controls in factories, the reality was that most workers continued to experience poor working conditions, long hours, and meagre wages. Despite the promise of a more just economic system, the reality of the early Soviet Union was one of hardship and deprivation for many. Food shortages, inflation, and the lack of essential goods were common throughout the country. Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership attempted to address these issues through policies such as war communism, which centralized control of the economy and requisitioned grain and other supplies from the countryside. However, war communism was deeply unpopular among the peasants, who resisted the state's efforts to requisition their produce, leading to famine and unrest. One of the most lasting and profound changes in Soviet society was the shift in gender roles and the legal status of women. Lenin and the Bolshevik government believed that the emancipation of women was a crucial part of the revolution. In the early days of Soviet rule, Lenin's government passed a series of laws aimed at improving the status of women. These included the legalization of abortion, the establishment of civil marriages, and the introduction of equal rights for women in the workplace. These changes were groundbreaking for their time and represented a bold challenge to the traditional patriarchal structures of Russian society. The revolution also had a significant impact on education and intellectual life in Russia. The Bolsheviks recognized that education was key to building the new socialist society. They sought to promote literacy and expand educational opportunities for the working class and peasants, two groups that had historically been excluded from formal education under the Tsarist regime. The creation of the workers' and peasants' faculties, which allowed workers and peasants to attend universities, was one of the more progressive steps in this direction. However, the difficulties of war, economic instability, and the need for political control over intellectual life meant that educational reforms were slow to fully take effect, and the Bolshevik commitment to free expression was soon tempered by a growing emphasis on ideological conformity. Lenin and the Bolsheviks also sought to transform the cultural landscape of Russia. Under Tsarist rule, culture had been controlled by the elite, and much of the artistic expression was restricted to the interests of the ruling classes. Lenin, however, believed that art and culture should serve the people, and he supported a wave of artistic experimentation in the early years of Soviet power. Movements like constructivism and prolet cult aimed to create a new form of art that was accessible to the masses, reflecting the revolutionary spirit of the times. However, as the state consolidated its power, the room for artistic and intellectual freedom began to shrink. Lenin's commitment to socialist realism, which demanded that art reflect the achievements of socialism and the struggles of the working class, soon became a guiding principle. While early Soviet art was marked by an eclectic mix of avant-garde styles, the push for ideological conformity gradually led to the suppression of artistic expression that did not align with the state's vision. Socially, the revolution brought with it the hope of equality, but this ideal was far from fully realized. While the new Soviet government promised equality for all, the realities of governance often meant that power remained concentrated in the hands of a few. The party elite, including figures like Joseph Stalin, began to build a bureaucratic system that centralized decision-making power and suppressed dissent. Lenin's early ideas of collective leadership and internal debate within the party were undermined as Stalin began to establish his own authoritarian rule. Lenin's own vision for the future of the Soviet Union was one of constant struggle and transformation. He understood that the revolution was far from complete, and that the true realization of socialist ideals would take time. However, the shift from revolutionary enthusiasm to the consolidation of state power led to tensions that Lenin, had he lived longer, would likely have had to address. Lenin's commitment to a planned economy, the centralization of power, and the dictatorship of the proletariat were central to his vision. But his later years showed him becoming increasingly concerned with the bureaucratization of the revolution, particularly with the rise of Stalin's influence. In the years following Lenin's death, the changes he had set in motion continued to unfold. His ideals, including the central role of the working class and the need for a strong centralized state, were institutionalized in Soviet policy. Yet, as Stalin's regime grew increasingly totalitarian, many of Lenin's early hopes for a more democratic socialist state were lost. Lenin's revolutionary ideas had set in motion the transformation of Russia, but the society that emerged was shaped by the very contradictions Lenin had struggled with: the need for centralized control, the conflict between ideology and the reality of governance, and the challenges of creating a just society in the face of war, famine, and political opposition, as Lenin's health began to deteriorate and his influence waned within the Soviet state. The political dynamics of the Bolshevik leadership began to shift. His physical decline not only affected his ability to lead, but also led to a significant reconfiguration of relationships within the party, setting the stage for the struggle over his legacy and the future direction of the Soviet Union. Lenin, once at the center of the revolution, now found himself a more passive figure, but his ideological and political influence still cast a long shadow over the party's actions. By the time Lenin was severely incapacitated by a stroke in 1922, the Soviet government had already undergone many crucial changes. The victory in the Russian Civil War had solidified Bolshevik rule, but the Soviet Union was still in its formative stages, and Lenin's health issues introduced a level of uncertainty about its future. While the revolution was consolidating, Lenin's ability to actively intervene in political matters was limited, forcing his closest allies to navigate the party's struggles without his direct leadership. Despite his declining health, Lenin remained intellectually engaged, writing letters, notes, and directives to the party, offering his insights on both domestic and international matters. His personal relationships with key figures within the Bolshevik Party, however, were becoming more complicated. Lenin had always been a pragmatic leader, willing to collaborate with a variety of personalities, but as his time in power drew to a close, his ideological concerns deepened, and his growing disillusionment with some of his colleagues became more evident. One of the most significant relationships in Lenin's later life was with Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Stalin, who'd been an ally during the revolution, had begun to rise to prominence in the party by 1922, securing control over key administrative positions. Lenin, who had initially seen Stalin as a loyal and capable leader, began to harbour deep concerns about his authoritarian tendencies and his concentration of power. Stalin's methods of dealing with party members, his increasing centralization of power, and his lack of respect for party democracy alarmed Lenin, who believed that the revolution could not succeed if it was reduced to a one-man show. In a document that would later be known as his testament, Lenin made his concerns about Stalin explicit. He wrote that Stalin's leadership style was too harsh, accusing him of being rude and of using his power in ways that threatened the unity and democratic structure of the party. Lenin recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. Though the document was not widely circulated at the time of its writing, it contained some of the most important reflections on the future of the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state. Lenin feared that Stalin's rise to power could corrupt the revolution's ideals and undermine the collective leadership that Lenin had long championed. At the same time, Lenin's relationship with Leon Trotsky, another key figure in the Bolshevik leadership, was marked by a sense of both unity and tension. Trotsky had been a brilliant military leader during the Civil War, and his intellectual contributions to the development of Marxism were invaluable to Lenin. However, their relationship was not without its complexities. Trotsky, a brilliant but often polarizing figure, had a more radical approach to revolution than Lenin, particularly when it came to the use of force and the role of the military. Despite their differences, Lenin viewed Trotsky as an essential ally and a key player in the success of the Bolshevik government. However, Lenin also recognized that the party was becoming more ideologically divided, with varying views on the direction of the revolution. Trotsky's rise, like Stalin's, represented a potential challenge to Lenin's vision of the future, especially as Lenin's own health worsened. Though Lenin remained supportive of Trotsky's leadership in many ways, the tensions within the party were growing, and Lenin's failure to effectively address these divisions due to his health would prove to be one of the crucial factors in the power struggles that followed his death. Another key relationship during this period was with Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife and longtime political ally. Krupskaya was a devoted supporter of Lenin and their relationship was one of deep intellectual and emotional connection. Throughout Lenin's illnesses, Krupskaya played a central role in caring for him, managing his correspondence and helping him communicate with other party members. She was a dedicated revolutionary in her own right. But as Lenin's health declined, the weight of the leadership burden increasingly fell on others, even as Krupskaya continued to support Lenin's ideas and vision. Lenin's withdrawal from active leadership was not just a matter of personal decline. It marked the beginning of a critical shift within the Bolshevik Party. Lenin had built the party as a tightly organized, centralized force, but as his influence waned, competing factions within the party began to assert their own power. The power struggle between Stalin, Trotsky, and other members of the leadership, such as Zinoviev and Kamenev, became the central focus of Soviet politics in the years following Lenin's death. As Lenin struggled with his health, his role within the party shifted from that of a powerful leader to a more symbolic figure. His ideas remained influential, and his image continued to serve as the unifying force for the revolution. But his direct involvement in the politics of the Soviet state was greatly diminished. This shift was symbolized by the fact that his death, when it eventually came, created a vacuum of power that no one could easily fill. Lenin's death in 1924 left a divided and unsettled leadership in its wake. In his final months, Lenin wrote less frequently but continued to be involved in party discussions when possible. His reflections on the future of the Soviet Union, however, increasingly focused on the direction the revolution would take after his death. He recognized the dangers of bureaucratization within the party and the need to preserve the revolutionary spirit. But his inability to act on these ideas and his reliance on his inner circle to carry out the work of governance meant that many of his concerns were sidelined in the chaotic political environment that followed. The internal divisions and power struggles that Lenin could not resolve ultimately defined the post-revolutionary period. Stalin's rise to power, which Lenin had warned against in his testament, marked the end of the collective leadership model Lenin had envisioned. Instead, Stalin's consolidation of power led to an increasingly centralized and authoritarian Soviet state, one that diverged sharply from Lenin's initial hopes for a more democratic socialist system. Stalin's interpretation of Marxism and Leninism, while rooted in Lenin's ideas, would take the Soviet Union down a path that Lenin would have likely opposed. Vladimir Lenin's final days were marked by both the sense of inevitability and a deep sense of loss for the revolution he had devoted his life to. After his stroke in 1922, Lenin's ability to directly influence the course of events within the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet state was severely diminished, but his presence, both intellectual and symbolic, continued to cast a long shadow over the Soviet Union and the communist movement worldwide. As Lenin's health deteriorated, the question of succession grew increasingly urgent. Though Lenin had become physically incapacitated, his ideas, leadership, and vision for the Soviet Union remained foundational to the future of the revolution. As Lenin's condition worsened, those closest to him, including his wife Nadezhda Krupskaya and his colleagues in the Bolshevik leadership, such as Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, sought to navigate the increasingly complex political environment. Within the party, while Lenin was still able to communicate, his ability to mediate the internal divisions of the Bolshevik leadership, particularly the rising influence of Joseph Stalin, was severely limited. One of Lenin's most significant final acts was the Testament, written between 1922 and 1923. In it, he expressed his growing concern about Stalin's behavior and the potential for the concentration of power in the hands of a single leader. Lenin, who had always been wary of authoritarianism and centralized power, feared that Stalin's methods could undo the ideals of collective leadership and party democracy that had been central to the revolution. He criticized Stalin's harsh treatment of party members, including his treatment of Trotsky, and suggested that Stalin should be removed from his position as General Secretary. However, due to his failing health and the lack of collective support, the testament was never fully implemented. Stalin, despite these warnings, remained in power and ultimately consolidated his control over the party after Lenin's death. Lenin's death on January 21, 1924, was a turning point for both the Soviet state and the broader revolutionary movement. Despite the years of illness and political uncertainty, Lenin's death signaled the end of an era for the Bolshevik Party. For many within the party and the Soviet population, Lenin remained a towering figure, revered as the leader who had brought about the revolution and established the Soviet Union. His vision for a socialist state, even as it remained incomplete, continued to inspire hope among workers and revolutionaries around the world. In the wake of his death, the Soviet state embarked on an extensive campaign to enshrine Lenin's legacy. His body was embalmed and placed on public display in Moscow's Red Square, where it was viewed by millions of citizens. Lenin's mausoleum became a symbol of his lasting influence, and his image was perpetuated in Soviet propaganda, where he was glorified as the father of the revolution. The state sought to immortalize Lenin, creating a mythos around his leadership and his role in the creation of the Soviet state. His writings were revered, and his revolutionary ideals were taught as the cornerstone of Soviet ideology. However, the portrayal of Lenin after his death would not always align with the man he had been. Stalin in particular worked to solidify his own leadership by co-opting Lenin's legacy and using it to justify his own policies. Stalin's rise to power in the years following Lenin's death would lead to a shift in Soviet governance that Lenin would likely have opposed. The harsh authoritarianism of Stalin's regime, including the Great Purge, forced collectivization, and the establishment of a totalitarian state, represented a sharp departure from Lenin's vision for a more democratic and pluralistic socialist society. Despite Stalin's manipulation of Lenin's legacy, Lenin's impact on the Soviet Union remained undeniable. The foundational principles of Marxism-Leninism, the Vanguard Party, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the goal of building socialism through a centralized state, became the official ideology of the Soviet Union. Lenin's ideas would continue to shape Soviet policy for decades, even as Stalin's interpretation of those ideas led to a regime marked by brutal repression and the cult of personality. Beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, Lenin's death, and the continuing reverence for his legacy, had a profound effect on revolutionary movements around the world. Lenin's example inspired workers, intellectuals, and political revolutionaries in countries as diverse as China, Cuba, and Vietnam. The success of the Bolshevik Revolution, followed by the creation of the Soviet Union, became a model for socialist movements globally. Lenin was revered as a revolutionary hero, and his ideas about imperialism, the role of the working class, and the necessity of armed struggle resonated with revolutionary groups fighting against colonialism and capitalism. However, the legacy of Lenin was not without its contradictions. While he was celebrated for his role in overthrowing the Tsarist regime and establishing a socialist state, his methods, particularly the use of force to suppress political opposition and the creation of a one-party state, were controversial. The suppression of the Constituent Assembly in 1918 and the crushing of other political dissent in the early years of the Soviet regime became points of contention for later generations. The Bolshevik government's response to dissent, whether from the anarchists, the Mensheviks, or even disillusioned workers and peasants, was often violent, and many of Lenin's early supporters would later criticize the authoritarian nature of Soviet rule. In the post-Soviet era, Lenin's legacy has continued to be a source of debate. In Russia, his image has been both revered and scrutinized as the country grapples with its Soviet past. While many see Lenin as the father of the Soviet state, others view him as a harbinger of the totalitarian system that would emerge under Stalin. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era in which Lenin's ideas were central to the governance of the state. Yet even today, Lenin's contributions to political thought and his role in the Russian Revolution continue to be studied and debated by historians, political theorists, and revolutionaries. Lenin's death left a void in the Soviet leadership that would ultimately be filled by Stalin, but his legacy remained central to the identity of the Soviet Union and the communist world. The vision of a just, socialist society that he espoused continued to inspire countless individuals and movements, even as the reality of Soviet governance diverged from the ideals Lenin had set forth. His commitment to revolutionary ideals, his tireless work to create a new society, and his role in shaping the course of history ensured that his memory would live on, a memory that continues to evoke both admiration and critique. Vladimir Lenin's life was marked by an unyielding commitment to a revolutionary vision that sought to upend centuries of oppression, inequality, and autocracy. His role in the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet Union left an indelible mark on world history, shaping the course of the 20th century. As the father of the Soviet state, Lenin's achievements are celebrated by some, while his methods and the consequences of his policies are critiqued by others. The complexity of Lenin's legacy continues to provoke debate, as both his contributions and the darker aspects of his rule are examined. Lenin's intellectual contributions to the development of Marxism were immense. He took the foundational ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and adapted them to the Russian context. Lenin's belief in the necessity of a vanguard party to lead the revolution was perhaps his most significant contribution to Marxist thought. Marx had envisioned the working class rising up to overthrow the bourgeoisie, but Lenin argued that the proletariat, though essential, would need leadership and organization to succeed. This concept of the vanguard party, a disciplined and ideologically unified group of professional revolutionaries, would become a cornerstone of Leninism and would shape the future of Soviet governance. Lenin's leadership of the Russian Revolution was instrumental in the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the establishment of the Soviet Union. His ability to inspire the masses, to organize and direct revolutionary forces, and to maintain the momentum of the revolution during the Civil War was crucial to the Bolshevik victory. Lenin's slogan, "Peace, Land and Bread," captured the demands of the worker and peasants, and his policies in the early days of the revolution, including land redistribution and the nationalization of industry, sought to fulfill these promises. Yet Lenin's revolution was not without its contradictions. While he championed the rights of workers and peasants, his government quickly adopted authoritarian methods to suppress opposition and consolidate power. The use of violence to suppress political dissent, including the suppression of rival socialist groups and the Red Terror against perceived enemies, demonstrated Lenin's willingness to use force in pursuit of the revolution's survival. Lenin justified these actions as necessary to protect the revolution from internal and external threats, but these measures laid the groundwork for the more repressive aspects of Soviet rule under Stalin. In his later years, Lenin became increasingly concerned about the direction the Soviet Union was taking. His criticisms of Stalin's rise to power, especially in his testament, revealed Lenin's growing unease with the concentration of authority within the party. Lenin feared that Stalin's methods would undermine the collective leadership that he had envisioned for the Soviet state. However, Lenin's inability to address these concerns directly, due to his declining health, allowed Stalin to solidify his control after Lenin's death, eventually leading to the creation of a totalitarian state that bore little resemblance to the more democratic workers' state that Lenin had originally envisioned. Lenin's impact on the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. He laid the foundation for the Soviet system, and his ideological and political legacy defined the course of Soviet history. Under Stalin, Lenin's ideas would be used to justify policies of state repression, forced collectivization, and the establishment of a one-party state. Stalin's reign marked a departure from Lenin's more democratic approach to governance, and Lenin's original vision of a socialist state led by a collective leadership was largely abandoned in favor of a more centralized authoritarian regime. Yet, despite the differences in their approaches, Stalin and his followers continued to invoke Lenin's name and use his writings to legitimize their rule. Globally, Lenin's influence on revolutionary movements was profound. His success in establishing the first socialist state in history served as a model for other Marxist movements around the world. Lenin's ideas inspired revolutions in places as diverse as China, Cuba, and Vietnam, where communist parties sought to follow in the footsteps of the Bolsheviks. Leninism, as it came to be known, became the guiding ideology of many socialist and communist movements throughout the 20th century. However, Lenin's legacy is also marked by its contradictions. While Lenin's revolution aimed to bring about a society based on equality and justice, the Soviet system that emerged after his death became one of extreme inequality, repression, and surveillance. The cult of personality that surrounded Lenin during his lifetime and after his death helped to perpetuate a distorted image of him as a perfect revolutionary, while the darker aspects of his rule, including the suppression of dissent and the use of terror to consolidate power, have been downplayed or excused by many of his followers. Lenin's commitment to revolutionary ideals was genuine, but his methods and the consequences of his leadership remain deeply problematic. In the post-Soviet era, Lenin's legacy has been the subject of intense debate. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Lenin's statues were toppled in many parts of the former Soviet republics, and his name was stripped from streets, schools, and public buildings. However, Lenin's legacy continues to be revered in certain circles, particularly among those who continue to identify with his revolutionary ideals. Lenin's role in the creation of the Soviet Union and the victories of the October Revolution are seen as crucial moments in the history of the 20th century, even if the outcomes of his revolution were far from what he had hoped. Today, Lenin is remembered as a complex and controversial figure, one whose ideas and actions continue to shape the world. For some, he remains a hero of the working class, a visionary who sought to create a just society. For others, he is a symbol of the authoritarianism and repression that would come to define Soviet rule. Lenin's life and legacy serve as a reminder of the tension between revolutionary ideals and the brutal realities of governing, and of the ways in which even the most well-intentioned movements can be distorted in the pursuit of power. Lenin's final resting place in Red Square, where his embalmed body lies on display, stands as a symbol of his enduring influence. His vision for a socialist society, though never fully realized, continues to inspire both admiration and criticism. As the world looks back on the revolutionary changes he helped to bring about, Lenin's life serves as a testament to the transformative power of ideas and the complexities of leadership in times of profound social upheaval. Vladimir Lenin's life was a story of revolutionary fervor, unwavering commitment, and profound transformation. From his early intellectual awakening to his leadership of the Russian Revolution, Lenin's journey was marked by an unyielding belief in the power of the people to reshape their destiny. He was the architect of the Soviet Union, the first socialist state in history, and his actions and ideas irrevocably changed the course of the 20th century. Yet the legacy of Lenin is a deeply complex one, marked not only by the triumphs of revolution, but also by the contradictions and challenges of implementing his vision. Lenin's unwavering commitment to Marxism, his ability to galvanize the masses, and his strategic brilliance made him one of the most influential figures in history. Under his leadership, the Bolsheviks toppled the Tsarist regime, established a new socialist government, and laid the groundwork for a global socialist movement that would shape the world for decades to come. However, the methods that Lenin employed to achieve these goals were not without consequences. The use of violence to suppress opposition, the authoritarian nature of the Soviet state under Lenin's rule, and his willingness to sacrifice democratic principles for the sake of consolidating power laid the foundation for the repressive system that would later be embodied in Stalin's regime. While Lenin's revolution aimed to empower the working class and dismantle the old aristocracy, the reality of Soviet governance in the years that followed became marked by totalitarianism, purges, and the suppression of dissent. Lenin's later years, marked by illness and political struggles within the party, revealed the fragility of the revolution he had fought for. His concerns about the rise of Joseph Stalin, as articulated in his testament, highlighted the tension between his revolutionary ideals and the reality of centralized power. Lenin's inability to act on these concerns due to his declining health allowed Stalin to ultimately rise to power, consolidating control in a way that would diverge significantly from Lenin's original vision. Yet despite these contradictions, Lenin's legacy remains deeply influential. His ideas about the role of the vanguard party, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the creation of a centralized socialist state were foundational to the Soviet Union's identity. His influence was not limited to Russia. Lenin's revolution inspired movements around the world, from China to Cuba, and his ideas shaped the course of socialist and communist thought throughout the 20th century. Today, Lenin's legacy is both celebrated and contested. In Russia and in former Soviet republics, Lenin's image remains a powerful symbol of revolution, progress, and the fight against oppression. Monuments to Lenin, once ubiquitous across the Soviet Union, have been removed or repurposed in the wake of the USSR's collapse. Yet his memory persists in the minds of those who continue to honor him as the father of the revolution. On the other hand, Lenin's legacy is also a source of critique. For many, the authoritarianism that emerged under Stalin, the repression of political dissent, and the concentration of power in the hands of a single party serve as reminders of the dangers of centralized control. The pursuit of revolutionary ideals, while noble, led to a system that, in many ways, contradicted the principles of freedom, democracy, and justice that Lenin had once championed. The Soviet Union, which Lenin helped to create, evolved into a system marked by censorship, fear, and the erosion of individual freedoms. As we reflect on Lenin's life and legacy, it becomes clear that he was a man of immense contradictions. He was a visionary who sought to create a better world, but the means by which he sought to achieve that world often led to unintended consequences. Lenin was driven by the belief that history could be shaped through revolutionary action, but in the end, his revolution was shaped by the very forces he had sought to destroy. In examining Lenin's legacy, we are forced to confront the complexity of revolution itself. The question of whether Lenin's ideals were realized, and whether his revolution ultimately benefited the people it aimed to empower, is one that remains open to debate. The Soviet Union that emerged from Lenin's revolution was both a triumph and a tragedy, embodying both the promises and the perils of radical political change. Lenin's life, his ideas, and his actions continue to shape the world today. His vision of socialism, his belief in the power of the people, and his commitment to revolutionary struggle continue to inspire movements around the world. Yet, his legacy also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the suppression of dissent, and the unintended consequences of even the most well-intentioned revolutions. As we reflect on Lenin's life and legacy, we are reminded of the enduring relevance of his ideas and the profound impact he had on the course of history. Whether we view him as a hero or a tyrant, a visionary or a pragmatist, Lenin's legacy is undeniable. A legacy that continues to provoke thought, inspire action, and challenge our understanding of revolution, power, and governance. Vladimir Lenin's life and legacy remain one of the most impactful and at times divisive in world history. His intellectual contributions to Marxism, his leadership of the Russian Revolution, and his role in establishing the Soviet Union reshaped the course of the 20th century. Yet the complexities of his political actions, his methods of governance, and the subsequent development of the Soviet state have led to an ongoing debate over the true nature of his legacy. Lenin was a man driven by conviction. His belief in the power of revolution and the necessity of overthrowing the old order propelled him through years of struggle, exile, and internal party divisions. From his early years in Simbirsk to his central role in the 1917 revolution, Lenin's revolutionary ideas guided him as he fought to build a world where the working class could overthrow the capitalist system and bring about socialism. His central belief was that the only path to freedom and equality for the masses was through revolution, and that the working class, under the leadership of a disciplined party, would lead the charge to create a socialist society. Under his leadership, the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, toppling the Tsarist regime that had ruled Russia for centuries. Lenin's leadership during the ensuing civil war was instrumental in the consolidation of power. The Soviet Union that emerged was deeply flawed, facing war, famine, and political divisions. Lenin's policies, including the new economic policy, NEP, helped stabilize the country, but the revolution was never fully realized in the way he had hoped. One of the major contradictions of Lenin's rule was his use of centralized power and violence to maintain control, actions that ran counter to the democratic ideals he espoused. Lenin's early government suppressed political opposition, curbed freedoms, and used force to ensure the survival of the revolution. While many of these actions were justified in the context of the civil war and the pressures the Bolsheviks faced, they also laid the groundwork for the authoritarian rule that would follow under Stalin. Lenin's relationship with Joseph Stalin is one of the most enduring elements of his legacy. Stalin's rise to power after Lenin's death in 1924 would radically alter the course of Soviet history. Though Lenin's testament criticized Stalin's methods and recommended his removal, Stalin's position within the party allowed him to sidestep Lenin's warnings. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union would undergo a dramatic transformation, moving away from Lenin's vision of a collective leadership and towards a centralized totalitarian state. Despite these later developments, Lenin's vision for the future of the Soviet Union remains central to the identity of the state. His commitment to creating a socialist society, even if that meant sacrificing certain democratic ideals in the short term, defined the direction of Soviet policy. Lenin's ideas about the vanguard party, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the role of the state in organizing society were fundamental to the structure of the Soviet Union, even as Stalin's interpretation of those ideas took them in a more authoritarian direction. Lenin's influence extended beyond Russia, inspiring revolutionary movements around the world. From China to Cuba, Lenin's ideas about class struggle, imperialism, and the role of the working class in overthrowing capitalist systems had a lasting impact on the global socialist movement. His creation of the first socialist state in history became a model for revolutionaries and intellectuals fighting against colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. However, the legacy of Lenin is not without its darker side. The authoritarian tendencies that were evident in Lenin's rule, particularly his use of force and suppression of political dissent, would later be expanded upon by Stalin. The Great Purge, forced collectivization, and the rise of a totalitarian state under Stalin represented a sharp divergence from the democratic ideals Lenin had once championed. Lenin's later years, particularly his concerns about the centralization of power and the rise of Stalin, suggest that he may have been uncomfortable with the direction his revolution was taking, even as he remained dedicated to the survival of the Soviet Union. The aftermath of Lenin's death saw his image enshrined in Soviet propaganda. His body was embalmed and displayed in Red Square, a symbol of his lasting influence on the Soviet Union. Lenin's writings became sacred texts, and his figure became synonymous with the ideals of socialism. The Soviet state used Lenin's legacy to justify its policies, even as the government evolved into a more authoritarian system. In the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Lenin's legacy has continued to be debated. His contributions to Marxist thought, his leadership of the Russian Revolution, and his role in creating the Soviet Union remain central to discussions about the 20th century. While many see him as a visionary who fought for the working class, others view his methods, including the suppression of dissent and the use of violence, as deeply problematic. Lenin's life and legacy raise important questions about the nature of revolution and the balance between ideals and the realities of governance. While Lenin believed in the power of the people, his methods of achieving socialism often contradicted his own democratic principles. The Soviet Union he created was a place where political repression, censorship, and the suppression of freedoms became commonplace, a state that, over time, bore little resemblance to the society Lenin had hoped to build. Lenin's story is one of profound transformation, both for Russia and the world. He was a man who sought to change the world through revolution, a man whose vision of socialism shaped the course of history. But his legacy is also a reminder of the complexities of power, the contradictions inherent in revolution, and the long-lasting consequences of political decisions made in the heat of struggle. As we reflect on Lenin's life and legacy, we're reminded of the enduring relevance of his ideas and the powerful impact he had on the history of the 20th century. Whether we see him as a hero, a tyrant, or something in between, Lenin's life offers valuable lessons on the nature of power, governance, and the pursuit of revolutionary ideals. As Lenin rose to prominence within the Russian revolutionary movement, his understanding of Marxism underwent a significant transformation. Marx's writings, though foundational, were a broad and theoretical framework that Lenin adapted and applied to the specific conditions of Russia. Lenin's intellectual journey was marked by the way he synthesized Marxist theory with the revolutionary struggle, making it practical, actionable, and tailored to the political and social circumstances of the Russian Empire. One of the central tenets of Marxism is the idea that history progresses through the conflict between social classes. Marx argued that the working class, or proletariat, would eventually rise up to overthrow the capitalist system, a struggle that would lead to the establishment of a classless, stateless society. However, Marx did not prescribe a detailed blueprint for how such a revolution should unfold in different contexts. It was Lenin's genius to take these ideas and adapt them to the situation in Russia, which was marked by an underdeveloped industrial base and a largely agrarian population. The first crucial step in Lenin's intellectual evolution was his rejection of the notion that Russia had to pass through a bourgeois revolution before a socialist one could occur. Unlike many Marxists who believed that Russia had to first undergo a period of capitalist development, Lenin saw the Russian conditions, including the discontent of the peasantry and the rapidly growing proletariat, as ripe for revolution. He believed that the working class, with the guidance of a disciplined vanguard party, could seize power and skip the phase of bourgeois democracy. For Lenin, the Russian Revolution would not be a mere repetition of the revolutions in Western Europe. Rather, it would be a more direct and immediate leap to socialist governance. Lenin argued that Russia, though backward in some ways, was at the threshold of revolution. He emphasized the importance of revolutionary leadership, creating a highly centralized, ideologically unified party that could lead the working class and peasants to victory. This was a significant departure from Marx's original idea of revolution being driven spontaneously by the working class. Lenin's leadership and ideas led to the formation of the Bolshevik Party, an organization that would become central to the revolution. He believed that the vanguard party needed to be composed of professional revolutionaries, those who were fully dedicated to the cause and could guide the masses to power. Lenin's theory of the Vanguard Party is perhaps his most enduring contribution to Marxist thought. He saw the party as the instrument through which the proletariat would be educated, organized, and led toward revolution, in contrast to the more moderate Mensheviks, who believed in a broader, more inclusive party. Lenin's Bolsheviks focused on discipline and ideological unity. Lenin argued that without this unity, the revolution could easily be co-opted or derailed by counter-revolutionary forces. The revolution, in his view, needed to be led by a small, well-organized and tightly controlled group of professional revolutionaries, ready to seize power at the right moment. Lenin's approach to Marxism was also deeply practical. While Marx had outlined the inevitability of socialism as a historical process, Lenin argued that revolution was not inevitable and required active intervention. He rejected the notion that socialism would come about automatically through historical progress. Instead, Lenin emphasized the need for organized political action, stating that the working class could not achieve its goals without a revolutionary party to guide them. For Lenin, theory and practice went hand in hand. He believed that revolutionary theory had to be tested through action, and that the success of the revolution depended on the ability of revolutionaries to act decisively and pragmatically when the time came. The Russian Revolution of 1917 demonstrated the power of Lenin's revolutionary theory. His ability to galvanize the masses, organize the workers and peasants, and create a disciplined political party was instrumental in the success of the Bolsheviks. But Lenin's vision of revolution was also deeply influenced by the international context. He saw the Russian Revolution not as an isolated event but as part of a global struggle for socialism. Lenin believed that the revolution in Russia would spark similar movements around the world, eventually leading to the spread of socialism across Europe and beyond. Lenin's approach to Marxism was also shaped by the war and the political environment in which he operated. The First World War had created an atmosphere of upheaval, and the Tsarist regime's failure to address the suffering of the masses created fertile ground for revolutionary change. Lenin's ability to recognize the potential of this moment and seize it for the revolutionary cause speaks to the flexibility and adaptability of his intellectual approach. Marxism, for Lenin, was not a static doctrine but a living framework for understanding and changing the world. While Lenin's intellectual contributions were significant, his leadership also demonstrated the limitations of Marxism as a guide for revolution. The realities of governing a post-revolutionary society required decisions and compromises that went beyond Marxist theory. Lenin's policies, including war communism and the New Economic Policy, NEP, represented pragmatic responses to the immediate challenges of war, famine, and economic collapse. While his theoretical contribution shaped the early years of the Soviet Union, the actual practice of building socialism proved far more complicated and contradictory than Lenin's original vision. Lenin's intellectual legacy, however, was undeniably influential in the development of the Soviet state. His adaptation of Marxist theory, particularly his ideas about the role of the Vanguard Party and the need for active intervention in revolution, shaped the direction of the Soviet Union for decades. The Bolshevik Revolution set the stage for a new world order, one that would see the rise of socialism as a global political force. In the years after Lenin's death, his intellectual contributions were codified as Marxism-Leninism, which became the official ideology of the Soviet Union and many other socialist states. Lenin's vision, as interpreted by his successors, would define Soviet policy for much of the 20th century. However, the limitations and contradictions of Leninism became apparent as the Soviet state evolved into a highly centralized and authoritarian regime under Joseph Stalin. Despite these developments, Lenin's intellectual influence remained a key foundation of Soviet socialism, and his writings continue to be studied by scholars, revolutionaries, and political theorists today. The rise of Bolshevism and Lenin's eventual leadership of the Russian Revolution can be traced back to his strategic genius and his ability to adapt Marxist theory to the conditions of early 20th century Russia. Lenin's political strategy, which combined tactical flexibility with ideological conviction, was a key factor in the success of the Bolshevik movement. His ability to organize, influence, and direct the proletariat in a country that was far from industrialized demonstrated his capacity for both pragmatism and vision. At the heart of Lenin's strategy was his belief that the working class, the proletariat, was the key to revolution. However, Lenin's interpretation of Marxism diverged from the mainstream Marxist view held by many of his contemporaries. While Marx had argued that revolution would come in industrialized nations, Lenin believed that Russia, despite its largely agrarian nature, could bypass the stage of bourgeois democracy and jump directly to socialist revolution. For Lenin, the conditions for revolution were ripe, and the working class needed a disciplined, professional revolutionary party to lead the charge. This led to the establishment of the Bolshevik Party as a highly centralized and tightly controlled organization. Lenin argued that the Revolutionary Party needed to be small and unified, consisting of committed professional revolutionaries who could guide the working class to power. He viewed the party as the vehicle through which revolutionary ideas could be propagated and action could be taken to seize power. The structure of the Bolshevik Party was one of strict discipline, a sharp contrast to the broader, more decentralized Menshevik faction, which favored a less authoritarian approach. Lenin's organizational approach was rooted in his belief that revolution was not an automatic or spontaneous event, but something that had to be carefully planned and executed. In Russia, where workers were still a minority, and the peasantry dominated the population, Lenin recognized that the working class alone could not bring about revolution. Instead, a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries would need to lead the way and guide the masses. This vanguard model became a defining characteristic of Lenin's political strategy, and it set the Bolsheviks apart from other socialist factions. Lenin's political strategy was also influenced by his understanding of Russia's political environment. Tsarist Russia was a deeply authoritarian state, and political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. Lenin's early experiences with repression and exile informed his approach to politics. He saw the autocracy as a deeply entrenched system that could not be reformed through peaceful means. For Lenin, the overthrow of the Tsarist regime could only be achieved through revolution, and this revolution would require a highly organized, disciplined political force capable of confronting the state's repressive apparatus. One of Lenin's most significant political moves was his ability to align the Bolsheviks with the broader discontent in Russian society. At the time of the revolution, Russia was facing enormous social, political, and economic pressures. The working class, particularly in industrial centers like Petrograd and Moscow, was growing in size and discontent with the ruling regime. The peasantry, which made up the majority of the population, was also suffering under the weight of poverty and exploitation. The First World War had only worsened the conditions, with widespread famine, economic collapse, and a high death toll. Lenin's ability to tap into this dissatisfaction and frame the Bolshevik movement as the true representative of the working class and peasantry was key to his success. Through slogans like peace, land, and bread, the Bolsheviks were able to appeal directly to the immediate needs of the Russian people. These slogans captured the essence of the Bolshevik promise: an end to the war, the redistribution of land, and the provision of food for the people. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, presented themselves as the only political force capable of delivering on these promises, distinguishing themselves from the more moderate factions that sought reform but were unwilling to challenge the power structure of the Tsarist regime. The October Revolution of 1917, which brought the Bolsheviks to power, was the culmination of Lenin's political strategy. The revolution was, in many ways, a direct result of the Bolsheviks' ability to capitalize on the failure of the provisional government, which had been established after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II in February 1917. The provisional government, led by figures like Alexander Kerensky, failed to end Russia's involvement in the war, address the land question, or provide for the basic needs of the people. As discontent with the provisional government grew, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized the opportunity to launch their own revolution. The Bolsheviks' success in the October Revolution was not merely the result of military force, but also of their political organization. The party's ability to act decisively and to capture key points in Petrograd, including the Winter Palace, was a testament to Lenin's strategic planning and the disciplined nature of the Bolshevik Party. The success of the revolution hinged on Lenin's ability to rally support, provide clear leadership, and implement a concrete vision for the future of Russia. This combination of theory and action made Lenin a master tactician in the revolutionary struggle. Lenin's approach to revolution was not one of mere theory, but one of practical application. He understood the need to maintain flexibility and seize opportunities when they arose. The rapid and decisive nature of the October Revolution and the subsequent consolidation of power by the Bolsheviks demonstrated Lenin's ability to translate revolutionary ideals into action. The immediate aftermath of the revolution posed significant challenges for the Bolshevik government. Lenin's political strategy, however, remained focused on consolidating power and securing the revolution. The Russian Civil War 1917–1923, which followed the revolution, would test Lenin's leadership and the Bolshevik Party's ability to maintain control. The Red Army, under the leadership of Trotsky, would fight off a coalition of royalists, moderate socialists, and foreign interventionists. Throughout this period, Lenin's political strategy continued to focus on centralizing power, managing the war effort, and ensuring that the revolution's goals were not derailed by internal or external enemies. Lenin's political strategy was marked by pragmatism and flexibility, but it was also rooted in a deeply held belief in the necessity of revolutionary action. His ability to adapt Marxist theory to the specific conditions of Russia and to implement his vision of a socialist revolution laid the foundation for the Soviet state. The Bolshevik Party, under Lenin's leadership, became the central force in shaping the future of Russia, and Lenin's political strategy would continue to guide the country long after his death. The Russian Revolution of 1917 set the stage for one of the most tumultuous periods in Russian history. The Russian Civil War 1917–1923. Lenin, having led the Bolshevik takeover in October 1917, now faced a new and even more daunting challenge: securing the revolution's survival against a host of enemies, both internal and external. The success of the October Revolution was only the beginning of the Bolshevik struggle to maintain control, and the ensuing civil war would test Lenin's leadership in profound ways. The Russian Civil War began almost immediately after the Bolshevik seizure of power. Lenin's government was immediately challenged by a diverse coalition of forces, often collectively referred to as the White Army. This group included monarchists, liberals, former Tsarist officers, moderate socialists, and others who opposed the Bolshevik agenda. They were united by their opposition to Lenin's radical socialist policies, but they were not a unified force in terms of ideology, strategy, or goals. This lack of unity among Lenin's enemies would work to his advantage. However, the White Army was not Lenin's only concern. The Bolsheviks also faced internal opposition from within their own ranks, most notably the Mensheviks and the Socialist Revolutionaries, SRs. These factions had differing views on the nature of the revolution and the future direction of Soviet Russia. The Mensheviks, for example, believed that the revolution should progress more gradually, advocating for a broad-based workers' government rather than the centralization of power in the hands of the Bolsheviks. The Socialist Revolutionaries, largely representing the peasantry, were also at odds with Bolshevik policies, particularly on land reform. Externally, the Bolshevik government faced the threat of foreign intervention. Countries like France, Britain and Japan, who'd supported the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II, now sent troops to support the anti-Bolshevik forces in an effort to prevent the spread of socialism. The intervention of foreign powers further complicated the already dire situation, making the survival of the Bolshevik regime all the more uncertain. Despite the challenges, Lenin's leadership during the Civil War proved instrumental in the survival of the Bolshevik government. The Civil War, while brutal and costly, ultimately solidified Bolshevik control over Russia. Lenin's ability to maintain focus on the strategic goals of the revolution and to mobilize both the Red Army and the population was crucial. Under Lenin's guidance, the Bolsheviks were able to rally the working class and the peasantry to the revolutionary cause, securing popular support for the Bolshevik vision and helping to maintain the revolution's momentum. One of the key strategies employed by Lenin was the creation of the Red Army, under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, one of the most skilled military strategists of the time, played a central role in organizing and directing the Red Army. Lenin's decision to place Trotsky at the helm of the military effort was crucial to the Bolshevik success. Trotsky's ability to inspire loyalty among soldiers and his tactical brilliance on the battlefield turned the Red Army into a formidable force. The Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police, also played a key role in securing Bolshevik control. Created in December 1917, the Cheka was tasked with eliminating internal opposition, suppressing counter-revolutionary activity, and maintaining order within the newly formed Soviet state. The Cheka became notorious for its ruthless tactics, including mass executions and imprisonment of suspected counter-revolutionaries. Though Lenin justified the use of terror as necessary for the survival of the revolution, the tactics employed by the Cheka were increasingly seen as a prelude to the authoritarian state that would emerge in the years following Lenin's death. At the same time, Lenin faced the challenge of managing the social and economic consequences of the revolution. The country was in ruins, and the economy had been shattered by years of war and internal strife. Lenin's government had to make difficult decisions regarding land redistribution, food production, and industrial output. The early policies of war communism, which centralized control of the economy and requisitioned food from peasants to feed the army and urban centers, were designed to support the war effort but led to widespread hardship, famine, and discontent among the peasantry. Despite the hardships, Lenin's ability to maintain control of the party and the government, even under such difficult circumstances, ensured the survival of the revolution. In 1921, Lenin recognized the need to shift from the extreme measures of war communism and introduced the new economic policy, NEP, which allowed for some private enterprise and market mechanisms to operate in the economy. This shift was a pragmatic response to the severe economic crisis facing Russia and was designed to restore agricultural production and trade. The NEP allowed peasants to keep and sell a portion of their grain, and small businesses were permitted to operate, while the state retained control of key industries like banking and heavy manufacturing. The NEP was a temporary measure, but it proved effective in stabilizing the economy and helping the Soviet state recover from the ravages of the Civil War. The policy helped to win back some support from the peasantry and the middle class, but it also created tensions within the Bolshevik Party. Hardline Marxists and left-wing Bolsheviks, including Nikolai Bukharin, were skeptical of the NP, seeing it as a betrayal of socialist principles. However, Lenin defended the policy as a necessary compromise in order to rebuild the Soviet state and ensure its survival. In the face of both internal and external challenges, Lenin's leadership during the Civil War demonstrated his ability to adapt, make difficult decisions, and maintain control over the revolution. While the war ultimately led to widespread destruction, Lenin's strategies ensured that the Bolsheviks would be able to hold on to power and begin building the foundations of the Soviet Union. By the end of the Civil War in 1923, the Bolsheviks had successfully defeated the White Army and consolidated their power over most of Russia. However, the costs of the war were immense. Millions of lives were lost, and the country was left in economic and social disarray. Lenin's ability to navigate these challenges and his vision of a socialist future for Russia would continue to influence the Soviet state for years to come, even as his health began to decline. Lenin's revolution in Russia not only reshaped the political landscape of the country, but also sent shockwaves throughout the world. The Bolshevik victory in 1917 represented the first successful socialist revolution, and its global impact cannot be overstated. Lenin's ability to take Marxist theory and apply it to the unique conditions of Russia provided a blueprint for revolutionary movements around the globe. As the Soviet Union emerged from the ashes of the Russian Empire, Lenin's ideas and the success of the Bolshevik Revolution inspired revolutionary movements in both the industrialized West and the colonized world. The Russian Revolution was a beacon for Marxists and socialists across Europe and beyond. For the first time in history, a socialist government had successfully seized power, overthrowing the monarchy and establishing a state based on workers' control. The victory of the Bolsheviks represented a real challenge to the capitalist world order, which had been established through centuries of imperialism and colonialism. Lenin's promise of peace, land, and bread resonated deeply with working-class movements and oppressed peoples everywhere. His revolution held the potential to inspire mass uprisings, offering a direct challenge to the capitalist system. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution, there were attempts to spread Bolshevik ideals across Europe. Lenin hoped that the Russian Revolution would be the first domino in a series of revolutions across the continent. The most significant early attempt to spread the revolution came in Germany. In 1919, the Spartacist uprising led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht sought to establish a socialist government in Germany. The uprising, though ultimately crushed by the German government, was a clear indication that the ideas of the Russian Revolution had caught the imagination of revolutionary socialists beyond Russia's borders. The Bolshevik victory also had a profound effect on other parts of Europe, especially in countries that had suffered under the oppression of imperialism. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were deeply committed to the idea of international revolution. For Lenin, the success of the Soviet state depended not just on the conditions in Russia, but on the spread of revolution across Europe. He believed that socialism could not survive in one country alone, especially one as economically backward as Russia. The Soviet Union's survival, in Lenin's view, depended on the victory of socialist revolutions in more advanced industrial nations. Though the hoped-for revolutions in Europe never fully materialized, Lenin's ideas continued to inspire revolutionary movements in the colonial world. Colonized peoples, particularly in Asia and Africa, saw in the Russian Revolution an example of how they could overthrow their imperialist rulers and establish their own independent socialist states. Lenin's ideas on imperialism, articulated in his influential work Imperialism, the Higher Stage of Capitalism, resonated with anti-colonial movements. Lenin argued that imperialism was an inevitable consequence of capitalism, and he encouraged revolutionaries in colonized countries to align themselves with socialist movements in their struggle for national independence. The Chinese Revolution, which culminated in the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, was one of the most significant examples of the global influence of Lenin's ideas. The rise of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party was directly influenced by Lenin's understanding of how a socialist revolution could be waged in a semi-feudal society. The Chinese Revolution borrowed heavily from Lenin's strategies, particularly the idea of a vanguard party leading the peasantry and working class to power. Mao's victory was seen as the triumph of Leninist Marxism applied to a different national context. In India, Lenin's influence was also significant. The Indian independence movement, led by figures like Subhas Chandra Bose and Bhagat Singh, was influenced by Marxist thought, and Lenin's ideas about anti-imperialist revolution provided a model for anti-colonial struggle. In the years following the Russian Revolution, many intellectuals and activists in the colonies began to view the Soviet Union as a symbol of resistance to imperialism. Lenin's revolution also played a role in the development of communist parties worldwide. In many countries, especially in the early 20th century, communist parties formed under the influence of the Soviet Union and aligned themselves with Lenin's vision. These parties were often involved in struggles against both imperialist powers and capitalist states. The success of the Bolshevik Revolution gave rise to an international network of communist parties, and Lenin's ideas on the role of the working class, revolution, and party discipline became the guiding principles of these movements. However, while Lenin's revolution inspired many, it also faced criticism and opposition. The Bolshevik government's use of violence, the suppression of political opposition, and the centralization of power were viewed as authoritarian by many critics. Lenin's government employed the Cheka, the secret police, to root out enemies of the revolution, and Lenin's policies often involved harsh repression of dissent, even within the socialist movement. For many, these actions were seen as a betrayal of the democratic principles that had initially motivated the revolution. Despite these criticisms, the international impact of Lenin's revolution was undeniable. The Russian Revolution was the spark that ignited revolutionary movements worldwide. Lenin's ideas on imperialism, the role of the working class, and the need for a vanguard party became central to the struggles of socialist movements, particularly in the colonized world. Even as Stalinism later overshadowed Leninism, the legacy of the Russian Revolution continued to inspire those fighting for freedom and equality in the face of imperialism and capitalism. After the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, Lenin was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding Russia's shattered economy. The country was deeply embroiled in the devastation of World War I and the ongoing Civil War, with widespread famine, industrial collapse, and the threat of foreign intervention. Lenin's economic policies would play a crucial role in shaping the early years of the Soviet state and determining its survival. Initially, Lenin and the Bolshevik government turned to war communism as the primary economic policy during the Civil War. War communism was designed to ensure that the Soviet state could maintain its military and political power in the face of widespread resistance and external threats. Its core features included the nationalization of all industries, the centralization of economic control, and the requisitioning of grain and food from peasants to feed the Red Army and urban populations. Lenin believed that a strong, centralized economy was necessary to win the Civil War and ensure the survival of the revolution. However, the implementation of war communism led to significant social and economic discontent, particularly among the peasantry. The requisitioning of grain by the Bolshevik government led to food shortages in the countryside, as peasants were left with little to sell or consume. Many peasants, already struggling under the weight of the war and revolution, resisted the government's policies. In addition, the nationalization of industry and the centralization of economic power created inefficiencies and a lack of incentives for workers. Industrial output plummeted, and the economy entered a state of severe crisis. The harshness of war communism caused widespread unrest. The Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921, led by sailors at the Kronstadt Naval Base, was one of the most significant uprisings against Bolshevik rule during this period. The sailors, who had been among the Bolsheviks' most loyal supporters during the revolution, revolted against the growing authoritarianism and the economic hardships imposed by war communism. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by the Red Army, but it was a clear indication that discontent with Bolshevik policies was widespread. Faced with these economic challenges and the threat of further unrest, Lenin recognized that a shift in economic policy was necessary. The dire state of the economy and the need to appease the population, particularly the peasants, led to the introduction of the new economic policy, NEP, in 1921. The NEP marked a significant departure from war communism and a temporary retreat from the principles of socialist economics. Under the NEP, Lenin allowed for some degree of private enterprise to operate in the economy. The policy permitted peasants to sell surplus grain on the open market, allowed for the re-establishment of small private businesses, and legalized the exchange of goods in local markets. The state retained control over the major sectors of the economy, including heavy industry, transportation, and banking, but the NEP allowed for greater market mechanisms in the rest of the economy. Lenin's goal was to revive agriculture and industry by creating a mixed economy that combined state control with private enterprise. The NEP was a pragmatic response to the immediate needs of the Soviet state. Lenin understood that the revolution could not be sustained without addressing the economic crises that were plaguing Russia. The policy was intended to stabilize the country, increase agricultural production, and provide some relief to the working population. In many ways, it was a necessary compromise between revolutionary ideals and the harsh realities of governing a war-torn and economically devastated country. The NEP had immediate positive effects on the Russian economy. Agricultural production began to recover as peasants were incentivized to grow more food, and trade between rural areas and urban centers increased. Industrial production also began to rise, as small businesses and private enterprises were able to operate more freely. The NEP provided a brief period of economic stabilization, which allowed Lenin to focus on consolidating power and securing the revolution. The policy was seen by many as a success in the short term, as it helped to restore confidence in the government and stabilize the economy. However, the NEP also faced significant opposition within the Communist Party. Many Bolsheviks, particularly those on the left wing, viewed the policy as a betrayal of socialist principles. They argued that allowing private enterprise and market mechanisms would lead to the re-emergence of capitalism and undermine the socialist goals of the revolution. Lenin, however, believed that the NEP was a temporary measure, necessary to rebuild the economy before moving forward with the full implementation of socialism. Lenin's leadership during this period demonstrated his pragmatic approach to economic and political challenges, his willingness to abandon certain aspects of his original vision in order to ensure the survival of the Soviet state, highlights the tensions between revolutionary ideals and the realities of governance. While the NEP was seen as a retreat from pure socialism, it was also a recognition of the need for flexibility and adaptation in the face of crisis. The NEP also represented a shift in Lenin's thinking about the role of the state in the economy. While the early years of Bolshevik rule had been marked by the centralization of economic control and the suppression of private enterprise, the NEP allowed for a more decentralized approach to economic management. Lenin's acceptance of some elements of the market economy marked a significant shift in Soviet economic policy and foreshadowed the more mixed economic policies that would characterize the Soviet Union in later years. In the years after Lenin's death, the NEP was gradually dismantled by Joseph Stalin, who moved towards more centralized state-controlled economic policies. Stalin's policies of forced collectivization and industrialization represented a return to the more radical aspects of Marxist economics and a rejection of the NEP's market-based mechanisms. While Lenin's NEP was a temporary measure, Stalin's economic policies would set the stage for the totalitarian state that would emerge under his leadership. Despite the eventual abandonment of the NEP, Lenin's economic policies were pivotal in the early survival and stabilization of the Soviet Union. The NEP provided a period of relative economic recovery, allowing the Bolshevik government to consolidate power and ensure the survival of the revolution. Lenin's pragmatic approach to economic governance, combined with his intellectual flexibility, helped the Soviet Union navigate the tumultuous early years of its existence. Lenin's impact on the Soviet Union and the world extended far beyond his leadership during the revolution and the early years of Bolshevik rule. The Soviet Union that emerged from the chaos of the Russian Revolution was in many ways the product of Lenin's vision and his tireless commitment to creating a new kind of state. Even after his death in 1924, Lenin's ideas and policies continued to shape the course of Soviet history, leaving a legacy that would endure for decades. The Soviet state that Lenin helped create was revolutionary not only in its structure but also in its ideology. Lenin's interpretation of Marxism, which emphasized the need for a vanguard party to lead the revolution, was foundational to the Bolshevik vision. Unlike Marx, who had believed that the working class would spontaneously rise up against capitalism, Lenin argued that a disciplined, centralized party of professional revolutionaries was necessary to guide the proletariat to power. This idea of the vanguard party became a core tenet of Leninist thought and would shape the structure of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, for much of the 20th century. Lenin's vision of the state was also influenced by his belief in the dictatorship of the proletariat. For Lenin, the transition from capitalism to socialism required a period of centralized state control, where the working class could assert its power and suppress the remnants of the old ruling class. Lenin's state was not a democracy in the conventional sense, but rather a dictatorship that would protect the revolution and guide society towards socialism. This idea of a strong centralized state would later be taken to extreme lengths under Stalin, but it was a critical part of Lenin's blueprint for the Soviet Union. One of the most important aspects of Lenin's legacy was his role in establishing the one-party state. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, understood that a revolutionary government could not afford the luxury of political pluralism, especially in the early stages of consolidation. The country was surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic, and the Bolsheviks believed that political unity was essential to surviving the revolution. Lenin's creation of a one-party state meant that the Communist Party was the only legitimate political force, and all other political parties were outlawed. This centralization of power in the hands of the party set the stage for the totalitarian nature of the Soviet system under Stalin. Lenin's policies also laid the foundation for the planned economy that would characterize the Soviet Union. While Lenin's policies during the revolution, such as war communism, were aimed at centralizing control over the economy to support the war effort, it was his later policies, particularly the New Economic Policy, NEP, that set the stage for the state-led economy that would dominate Soviet life. The NEP allowed for a limited return to market mechanisms, but it also established the principle that the state would control key industries and economic sectors. Lenin believed that the state's control over the economy was essential for building socialism and ensuring that the working class was not exploited. Lenin's influence on Soviet culture was also profound. Early on, he recognized the importance of education and propaganda in shaping the new socialist society. Under Lenin, the Soviet government worked to promote literacy and provide education to the masses, particularly in rural areas. The goal was to create a new kind of citizen, one who was politically conscious, ideologically committed, and capable of participating in the building of socialism. Lenin also promoted revolutionary art and culture that reflected the ideals of the Bolshevik Revolution. However, this cultural freedom would be curtailed in the years after Lenin's death, as the Soviet state increasingly sought to impose ideological conformity. Lenin's role in establishing the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, was another critical aspect of his legacy. The Cheka was created in 1917 to protect the revolution from internal enemies, and it played a key role in suppressing counter-revolutionary activity, political opposition, and dissent. Under Lenin, The Cheka was tasked with carrying out mass arrests, executions, and imprisonments of suspected counter-revolutionaries. While Lenin justified these actions as necessary for the survival of the revolution, the use of terror became a hallmark of Soviet governance, reaching its zenith under Stalin. The Cheka would eventually evolve into the NKVD, the state's main tool for political repression during Stalin's reign. In terms of foreign policy, Lenin's vision for the Soviet Union was one of permanent revolution. He believed that the success of the Russian Revolution could only be guaranteed if socialist revolutions spread to other countries. Lenin viewed the Soviet Union as a beacon of hope for the international working class, and he sought to export the revolution to Europe and beyond. His leadership during the formation of the Comintern, the Communist International, in 1919 aimed to unify socialist and communist parties around the world and coordinate revolutionary efforts. While the success of the Soviet model was mixed internationally, Lenin's efforts to inspire global revolution set the stage for the Soviet Union's influence in world affairs for the rest of the century. Lenin's legacy, however, is not without its contradictions. On the one hand, he's remembered as the leader who brought about one of the most significant social and political transformations in history, overthrowing the Tsarist regime and establishing the first socialist state. On the other hand, his methods, particularly the use of violence, repression, and terror to maintain control, have been heavily criticized. Lenin's creation of the one-party state and his suppression of political opposition set the stage for the totalitarianism that would follow under Stalin, leading to a regime that, while continuing to pay homage to Lenin's ideas, would become far more oppressive. Despite these contradictions, Lenin's influence on the Soviet Union and the world is undeniable. He laid the groundwork for the system that would govern Russia for much of the 20th century. The Soviet Union that emerged from Lenin's revolution would become a superpower, influencing global politics, economics, and culture. Lenin's ideas, while adapted and altered by his successors, remained a foundation for Soviet ideology and continue to be a point of reference for socialist movements worldwide. By the early 1920s, Lenin, the man who had led the Bolshevik Revolution and shaped the Soviet state, was facing a new and more personal battle: his declining health. The physical toll of years of revolutionary struggle, combined with the stress of leading the Soviet Union through its formative years, began to take its toll on Lenin. The effects of this decline were felt not just by Lenin himself, but by the entire Bolshevik party, as his absence left a vacuum in leadership that would soon become a critical factor in the future of the Soviet Union. In May 1922, Lenin suffered his first stroke, which left him partially paralyzed and unable to carry out the day-to-day responsibilities of leadership. Despite this, Lenin continued to play a role in Soviet politics, attempting to stay involved in key decisions and providing guidance to his fellow Bolshevik leaders. However, his health continued to worsen, and by the end of 1922 he had suffered a second stroke, which left him almost completely incapacitated. His once razor-sharp intellect, which had driven the revolution and shaped the early Soviet state, was now clouded by illness, and Lenin became largely reliant on his inner circle for decision-making. Lenin's deteriorating health had profound consequences for the future of the Soviet Union. As Lenin struggled with his physical limitations, the question of succession within the Bolshevik Party became more pressing. Despite the fact that Lenin was still the undisputed leader of the revolution, his health made it increasingly difficult for him to provide the strong central leadership that had characterized his earlier years. The power vacuum left by Lenin's illness would set the stage for a political struggle that would define the Soviet Union for the next several decades. One of the most significant aspects of Lenin's final struggles was his growing concern about the future of the revolution and the direction of the Soviet state. In his later years, Lenin became increasingly worried about the concentration of power within the Bolshevik Party and the rise of bureaucratism. While Lenin had initially advocated for a government that represented the working class, he became alarmed by the growing influence of individuals within the party who seemed more concerned with consolidating their own power than with advancing the revolutionary goals of the Bolshevik movement. This concern culminated in Lenin's famous testament, written in 1922 and early 1923. In the testament, Lenin offered his thoughts on the state of the revolution and the future of the Soviet Union. One of the most notable features of the document was Lenin's growing disillusionment with Joseph Stalin, who had become a prominent figure within the Bolshevik party. Lenin criticized Stalin for his authoritarian style, particularly his treatment of party members, and he suggested that Stalin be removed from his position as general secretary. Lenin expressed concern that Stalin's consolidation of power within the party could undermine the democratic principles of the revolution and jeopardize the future of the Soviet state. However, Lenin's health prevented him from taking any decisive action to address the issues he raised in the testament. The document was not widely circulated within the party, and its recommendations were largely ignored by Lenin's colleagues. By the time of Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin had solidified his position within the party, and his rivals, including Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Lev Kamenev, were too divided to mount an effective challenge. Stalin's eventual rise to power after Lenin's death would represent a sharp departure from Lenin's vision for the future of the Soviet Union, as Stalin moved the country toward a more centralized, authoritarian system of governance. Despite the political infighting that characterized Lenin's final years, his vision for the revolution remained steadfast. Lenin had always believed that the survival of socialism required the spread of revolution beyond Russia's borders. He saw the Russian Revolution as the first step in a global struggle against capitalism and imperialism, and he hoped that the Soviet Union would serve as the catalyst for further socialist revolutions around the world. In his later years, Lenin focused on the international struggle, hoping that revolutions in Germany, Hungary, and other European countries would create a socialist bloc that could support the Soviet state. Lenin's declining health also raised important questions about the future of the Bolshevik party. The centralization of power in the hands of a few key figures, particularly Stalin, Trotsky, and others, created tensions within the party. Lenin had long been an advocate of collective leadership, believing that decision-making should be based on democratic principles within the party. However, as Stalin and his allies began to consolidate their power, Lenin's vision of a collective leadership was increasingly sidelined. In his final months, Lenin was unable to resolve the growing tensions within the party or address the emerging leadership crisis. The fragmentation of the Bolshevik leadership, combined with the increasing authoritarianism within the party, left the Soviet Union vulnerable to internal struggles for power. When Lenin passed away in January 1924, the future of the revolution and the Soviet state was left in the hands of those who would soon engage in a brutal power struggle that would culminate in Stalin's rise to absolute power. Lenin's death marked the end of an era for the Soviet Union, but his ideas and his revolutionary legacy continued to influence the country and the world long after his passing. The Soviet Union would undergo radical transformations under Stalin, but the ideological foundation of Leninism remained central to the governance of the Soviet state. Lenin's contributions to Marxist thought, his leadership of the Russian Revolution, and his role in shaping the early years of the Soviet Union left an indelible mark on the history of the 20th century. Lenin's final struggles, both in terms of his physical health and his concerns about the future of the revolution, demonstrated his commitment to the principles of socialism and his belief in the potential for the working class to build a just society. However, his failure to address the leadership crisis within the Bolshevik Party set the stage for the rise of a more authoritarian regime under Stalin, whose policies would diverge sharply from Lenin's vision. Despite this, Lenin's legacy remains one of the most significant in world history, and his influence continues to be felt today.